Tonight we're going to settle into something vast and melancholic. We're going to trace the entire story of the Dark Souls trilogy, from the age before time itself to the dying embers of a world that has burned itself to ash over and over again. This is a tale about cycles that cannot be broken, about gods who fear the dark, about heroes who sacrifice themselves to delay the inevitable, and about the question that haunts every corner of these games. When a flame is dying, should you let it fade into darkness, or should you burn yourself to keep it alive just a little bit longer? Get comfortable. Let the sounds of the world fade away. Because we're about to journey through thousands of years of history, through kingdoms that rose and fell and were forgotten, through the lives of gods and monsters and the undead who wander between them. This is the story of Dark Souls. Let's begin at the very beginning, in a time so ancient that even calling it a time feels fundamentally wrong. This was the Age of Ancients, and it existed in a state that our minds, shaped as they are by the concepts of change and progress and entropy, can barely hope to comprehend. There was no life as we understand it. There was no death to give meaning to that life. There was no heat to warm, no cold to freeze, no light to see by, no darkness to hide within. The world existed in a perfect, eternal grey, unchanging and unending, a state of absolute stasis that had persisted for so long that the very concept of duration had no meaning. The land was dominated by vast arch trees, stone pillars of such immense scale that they seemed to hold up the grey sky itself, though in truth there was no distinction between sky and ground in this ageless world. These trees were more ancient than ancient, older than the idea of old, their roots disappearing into depths that had no bottom because depth itself was a concept that would only come later, their branches reaching toward heights that had no top for the same reason. They simply were, and always had been, and always would be, eternal fixtures in an eternal landscape. And ruling over this grey world, perched upon the arch trees and the stone crags that jutted from the formless earth, were the everlasting dragons. These were not creatures in the sense we understand creatures. They were not animals that ate and bred and died. They were forces of nature given physical form, eternal and unchangeable as the rocks themselves. Their bodies were covered in stone scales, not scales like a fish or a snake, but true stone, as hard and enduring as the grey crags they roosted upon, completely impervious to any conceivable damage. They could not be wounded because wounding requires the possibility of change, and change did not exist. They could not age because aging requires the passage of time, and time had no passage, only eternal presence. They could not die because death is the ultimate change, and they were as permanent as the grey world itself, as much a part of the fundamental fabric of existence as the arch trees and the stone. The dragons did not build civilizations or wage wars or pursue ambitions or dream of better days. They simply existed, flying their eternal circuits between the arch trees, perching on the grey stone, living lives of perfect, meaningless immortality. There was no progress in this world because progress requires change. There was no history because history requires events, and events require things to happen, and happening requires change, and change did not exist. Everything that was, always had been, and always would be. It was a world of perfect balance, of absolute equilibrium, where nothing could ever truly happen because happening would disturb the perfect stillness. In the hollows far below the arch trees, In the darkness beneath the grey world, where not even the pale light of the grey sky could penetrate, there were other creatures. These were beings that would later be called Hollows, though they had no name in that age because names had no meaning when nothing could be distinguished from anything else. They huddled in the dark, mindless and formless, without purpose or thought or desire, any of the qualities that make something alive rather than merely existing. They were shadows of life, potential beings waiting for something to give them definition, to make them real. But in the age of ancients, that something did not exist. The Hollows simply waited in the darkness, generation after identical generation, if generations could even be said to exist when nothing ever changed, never growing, never learning, never becoming anything more than shadows. This age might have continued forever. There was nothing to suggest it would ever end. The everlasting dragons would have flown their eternal circuits for all eternity. The Hollows would have huddled in their eternal darkness until the end of time, which would never come because time itself was meaningless. The Archtrees would have stood their eternal watch over a world where watching and not watching made no difference because nothing ever happened to watch. It was a world where nothing could ever truly live because life requires change, requires growth, requires the possibility of death to give meaning to existence. Everything was grey and perfect and meaningless and eternal. But then, something happened. Something that had never happened before in this world, where nothing had ever happened. Something that by all rights should not have been possible in a world of perfect stasis and absolute unchangeability. Deep in the darkness beneath the earth, in the deepest hollows where the shadows were thickest, and where the Hollows had waited for untold ages without even knowing they were waiting, there came a spark. Just a tiny spark at first, barely noticeable, the smallest possible disturbance, in the perfect equilibrium. And from that spark came flame, and from that flame came everything that would follow, everything that would ever matter, all of history and all of suffering and all of beauty and all of tragedy. The first flame burst into existence like a scream of defiance against the eternal silence, where it came from, why it appeared, what force could create change in a world of perfect changelessness, what cosmic accident or divine intervention or quantum fluctuation could bring fire to a world that had never known heat. These questions have no answers. The scholars and sages of later ages would speculate endlessly, would create elaborate theories and mythologies to explain the first flame's origin, but the truth is simpler and more terrible. The flame simply was as impossible and inevitable as existence itself. It just appeared, and with it, everything changed. With the flame came disparity. Where before there had been only grey sameness, now there were opposites, differences, distinctions, heat and cold. Where before there had been neither because neither had meaning without the other, life and death. Where before there had been only timeless existence without the possibility of either, and most importantly, most fundamentally, most terribly, light and dark, where before there had been only endless grey that was neither one nor the other, the flame brought the concept of difference into a world that had known only sameness, and that difference was the crack that would eventually shatter everything. The flame changed everything it touched. It brought possibility into a world that had known only certainty. It brought endings into a world that had known only eternity. And with endings came the possibility of beginnings, of new things starting where old things ended. It brought meaning into a world that had been perfectly meaningless, because meaning requires difference, requires one thing to matter more than another, and difference had not existed before the flame. The Age of Ancients, that timeless grey world of everlasting stone and eternal dragons, began to crack and fade the moment the first flame appeared, like ice beginning to melt in the first rays of spring sun after an endless winter. The flame had arrived, and nothing, not the everlasting dragons with their stone scales and their timeless power, not the grey world itself, not the very concept of unchangeable eternity, nothing would ever be the same again. The Age of Grey was ending, though it would take a war to make that ending final. The Age of Fire was beginning, though no one yet understood what that would mean. And in the darkness of the deepest hollows, drawn by the light and warmth of something they had never imagined could exist, the hollows began to stir, began to move, began to become something more than shadows for the first time in their long, empty existence. The hollows that had huddled in darkness for uncounted ages, for so long that counting itself had no meaning, were drawn to the first flame like moths to a candle, like pilgrims to a shrine, like the lost finding home for the first time. The light called to them across the void, pulling them up from the depths where they had waited forever, compelling them toward the source of this new warmth and radiance that sang to something deep in their shadowy forms. They climbed up through the darkness, driven by an urge they could not name because they had no names for anything, no thoughts to contain names, only the pull of the flame drawing them onward. And there, gathered around the first flame in that deep hollow beneath the world, they found something that had never existed before. They found power. Not the eternal, unchanging power of the dragons who simply were powerful, because they had always been powerful, but something new, something that could be claimed and wielded and used, scattered around the first flame, glowing with inner light, pulsing with energy that seemed almost alive, were 4 souls of incredible potency. These were not ordinary souls. Even calling them souls was inadequate, a name that would only make sense later, when lesser souls were common, and these could be distinguished as greater. These were Lord Souls, fragments of the first flame's power given form and substance, each one containing enough raw strength to reshape reality itself, to tear down the old world and build a new one. They sat there in the light of the flame waiting, almost as if the flame had created them for a purpose, almost as if it wanted to give its power away. 4 beings claimed them, 4 hollows who stepped forward from the huddled masses and reached out and took hold of power beyond imagining. They stepped into the flame's light and emerged transformed, changed utterly and irrevocably, ascending from hollow shadows into something infinitely greater, something that would come to be called gods. The first was Gravelord Nito, the first of the dead. The Lord's soul he claimed granted him dominion over death itself, the power to administer the end of all living things, where before death had not existed because nothing could die. Now Nito embodied its inevitability. His very presence brought decay. The ground rotted beneath his feet. Plants withered at his passing. His touch brought dissolution, the gentle return of all things to the earth from which they came. He was death personified, a towering figure shrouded in a miasma of dissolution and disease, his body draped in the bones of countless dead, though none had died yet, his cloak made from the corpses that would be, his staff carved from a femur larger than any creature that currently existed. Nito understood that death was not an ending, but a transformation, the final change that all living things must undergo. He would become the shepherd of all those who passed from life into whatever lay, beyond, the guardian of the boundary between existence and non-existence. His power was terrible and necessary, the dark mirror to life itself, and he accepted his role with the solemnity it demanded. The second was the Witch of Izalith, who claimed a lord's soul of life and fire. She became the mother of flame sorcery, the one who understood fire not as mere destruction, but as the fundamental force of creation itself. She could birth new life from flame, could transform souls into living beings, could nurture and create and bring forth with the power of her burning soul. Fire in her hands was not the end but the beginning, the spark that kindled existence, the warmth that allowed things to grow. The witch gathered daughters around her, sharing fragments of her power with them, creating a family of flame keepers who would tend the fires of creation for ages to come. They wore gold-hemmed black robes that somehow did not burn despite the flames that wreathed them. They wielded their fire with precision and grace, calling forth great firestorms when needed, gentle warming flames when desired. The witch was life's opposite to Nito's death, the spark that kindled new existence in a world that had known only static eternity, and she embraced this role with the fierce love of a mother for all that she would help bring into being. The third was Gwyn, who would come to be called the Lord of Sunlight, the first among the gods, the king of the new age that would dawn. His lord's soul granted him power over light itself, over the very essence of the first flame. Where Nito commanded death and the witch commanded life, Gwyn commanded illumination, the driving force that would push back the dark and establish an age of radiance. His lightning could split the heavens, bolts of white-hot power that could crack stone and shatter shields and reduce flesh to ash. His sunlight could banish any shadow, could warm any chill, could bring the day to places that had only known the grey, twilight of the Age of Ancients. Gwyn was radiant and terrible, a god of power and might and unshakable will. He looked at the grey world of dragons and saw something that needed to be transformed, remade in the image of light and heat. He saw a future where gods would rule, where the darkness would be held at bay, where the light would reign eternal. Of all the lords, Gwyn would have the greatest impact on the ages to come, for better and for worse, his choices shaping the destiny of the world more than any other single being. His determination to preserve the light would eventually become an obsession, and that obsession would create suffering on a scale even he could not have imagined. But there was a fourth soul, a soul that the other lords barely noticed, so caught up were they in their own transformation, in the rush of power and possibility that flooded through them. While Gwyn, Nito and the witch claimed their lord souls and began their ascension to godhood, while they stood in the flame's light and felt themselves become something greater, one being took the fourth lord's soul and quietly, without fanfare or declaration, slipped away into the shadows from which all hollows had come. This was the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten, so small and insignificant compared to the radiant power of the other lords. Where Gwyn blazed with light and Nito radiated death, and the witch glowed with the warmth of creation, the pygmy simply left, took his soul, the dark soul as it came to be called, and vanished into the darkness. None of the other lords paid him any mind. He was small, unremarkable, forgettable. Surely he posed no threat. Surely his soul, dark where theirs were bright, was somehow lesser, weaker, less important. This assumption would prove to be one of the most catastrophic errors in all of history. The pygmy did not seek to build kingdoms or command armies, or transform the world with great works of power. His ambitions were subtler, quieter, and in the end far more enduring. Instead of using his lord's soul to elevate himself, instead of becoming a singular great being like the others, he took his soul and he split it apart. He scattered fragments of the dark soul across the world like seeds, and from each fragment came a human. Not a god, not a lord, not an eternal being of power, just human. Mortal, fragile, small, weak by the standards of gods and dragons. Beings that would live and die in the blink of an eye, compared to the timeless existence of the everlasting dragons. But each human carried within them a tiny piece of that dark soul, a fragment of darkness to balance the light of the first flame. Each one held within them a connection to the deep dark that existed before light, that would exist after light faded, that was as fundamental to existence as the light itself. And this would prove crucial in ages to come, though none of the lords understood it yet. While Gwyn and Nito and the witch burned bright with the fires, power, while they wielded light and death and life as weapons and tools, humanity was born of darkness, and the darkness would always remain patient and quiet and inevitable, waiting for the flame to fade so that the age of dark, the age of men, could finally begin. The four lords and their followers looked at the world around them and saw it for what it was, a prison. The everlasting dragons ruled everything with their eternal, unchanging dominion. The grey world stretched on forever in all directions, unchanging and unchallengeable. But the lords had the power to challenge it now. They had souls, and souls meant power. Power meant the possibility of change, and change meant the dragon's eternal reign could be ended, must be ended, would be ended. So the lords declared war. They would overthrow the everlasting dragons who had ruled since before time began. They would end the age of ancients and shatter the grey world that had existed forever. They would bring fire and death and life to this timeless place, and from the ashes of the old age, they would build something new. They would create an age of fire, an age where the gods ruled, where life flourished and died and flourished again, where change and progress and story became possible for the first time ever. But first they had to solve an impossible problem. They had to find a way to kill creatures that could not be killed. They had to overcome the dragon's immortal stone scales that had never been pierced, never been broken, never been so much as scratched in all the endless ages of their existence. They needed an advantage that the dragons, in all their eternal power and timeless existence, did not possess. They needed a traitor. They needed one of the dragons to betray their own kind, to reveal the secret that would bring them all down. And by chance or fate, or the cruel irony that would come to define the Dark Souls world, they found one. The dragons had ruled for so long that certain concepts simply did not exist among them. Betrayal was one of those concepts. There was no reason for betrayal because there were no conflicts among them, no desires that might set one dragon against another, no ambitions that might make one seek advantage over its kin. They existed in perfect harmony because they existed in perfect stasis, each one as eternal and unchangeable as all the others. The idea that one of them might side with the upstart hollows against their own kind was so foreign, so impossible, that none of them even conceived it as a possibility. This made them vulnerable in a way they had never been before and could never have anticipated. Among the everlasting dragons was one who was different, one who had been born into wrongness, into imperfection, into a state that marked him as lesser from the very beginning. His name was Seath, and he was born without scales, where every other dragon possessed those impenetrable stone scales that made them truly everlasting. Seath's hide was pale and vulnerable, smooth and scaleless like the exposed skin beneath a shed shell. He was an albino dragon, his skin white as bone, his eyes blind and empty, his body ending in a mass of tentacles rather than proper dragon legs. Seath was mortal in a way his kin were not. He could be wounded where they could not. He could die where they could not. And this made him separate, made him other, made him something less than a true everlasting dragon in the eyes of his brethren, though none would say it outright. He was tolerated but not truly accepted, allowed to exist among them but never quite one of them, always aware that he lacked the one thing that defined their kind, the immortality granted by those stone scales. Whether it was resentment or ambition or simple survival instinct, whether he harboured genuine hatred for his kind or simply saw an opportunity and took it, Seath chose to betray his own species. He went to the Lords, to Gwyn and Nito and the Witch, descending from the arch trees where the dragons roosted, approaching the hollows who had claimed the Lord's souls, and he told them the secret that would doom his entire race. The stone scales were the key. Those scales were what made the dragons immortal, what rendered them impervious to any damage, what allowed them to exist eternally in the Age of Ancients. If the scales could be broken, if they could be cracked and peeled away, if the immortal armour could be stripped from the dragons' bodies, then the flesh beneath could be wounded, and if they could be wounded, they could bleed, and if they could bleed, they could die. The secret was so simple, it was almost laughable. The everlasting dragons were only everlasting because of their scales. Remove the scales, and they became as mortal as anything else. Gwyn saw his opportunity and seized it with both hands. His lightning, that white-hot power that came from his lord's soul, could break stone where nothing else could. He had the weapon that could strip the dragons of their immortality, that could peel away those impenetrable scales and expose the vulnerable flesh beneath. And so the war began in earnest, the lords and their followers rising up against the eternal rulers of the grey world. The lords gathered their forces for the conflict that would reshape reality itself. Gwyn commanded an army of knights, warriors who wielded his lightning and bore his symbols, who carried great shields and wore silver armour that gleamed in the light of the first flame. They trained for the war, learning to fight in ways that had never been necessary before because there had been nothing to fight. Nito brought the power of death itself to the battlefield, disease and decay and miasma that could weaken the dragons from within, could rot their flesh even if their scales still held. The Witch of Izalith brought her flames, fires hot enough to rival the first flame itself, storms of burning, destruction that could reduce stone to molten slag and fill the grey sky with smoke and ash for the first time in history. And the humans, those small creatures born of the dark soul that the pygmy had scattered, they came too. They were so small compared to the dragons, so weak and fragile, but they wielded weapons forged from the darkness itself, swords and spears and arrows that could find gaps in the scales where lightning and fire could not. They fought alongside the lords against the ancient rulers of the world, and though they died in droves, though thousands fell for every dragon that was slain, they kept coming, kept fighting, kept refusing to surrender. The war was brutal beyond description, beyond anything that could be imagined by those who had only known the peaceful eternity of the Age of Ancients. For every dragon that fell, dozens of the Lord's forces died, crushed beneath massive claws or incinerated by dragon fire or simply battered aside like insects. The dragons were still mighty, still terrible, even without the complete protection of their scales. They could crush armies beneath their feet, could incinerate entire regiments with their breath, could fight with the fury of beings who had never known defeat and who understood for the first time that they could die. But they could die now. That was the crucial difference that changed everything. The dragons fought with all the power and rage of beings who had existed since before time began, but for the first time in their eternal existence, they learned what it meant to fall, to fail, to end. And once they could end, it was only a matter of time before they did. Gwyn himself led the charge, his lightning bolts streaking across the grey sky like cracks in reality itself, each one peeling apart dragon scales like a sculptor chipping away at marble. Once the scales were broken, once that immortal armour was breached, the dragons bled red blood that steamed in the cold air, and once they bled, Nitos, death could claim them, could pull them down into the darkness from which nothing returns. The witch's flames could consume their flesh, could reduce their mighty bodies to ash and bone. One by one, the everlasting dragons fell from the sky where they had flown since before the world knew time, their massive bodies tumbling from the arch trees, crashing into the grey stone, shattering the ancient rocks with the impact. The grey world that had been perfect and unchanging for all eternity ran red with dragon blood for the first time. The sky filled with smoke from the witches' fires. The earth shook with the thunder of Gwyn's lightning. The air carried the stench of Nito's rot, and the dragons, those eternal beings who had ruled unchallenged since the very beginning, learned what it meant to know fear, to know pain, to know that they could be defeated. Seath was rewarded lavishly for his betrayal, given treasures and honours that would have been incomprehensible to his former kin. Gwyn granted him a fragment of his own Lord's soul, elevating the scaleless Drake to a status approaching divinity, making him more than a mere dragon, almost an equal to the lords themselves. Seath was given the title of Duke, a position of prestige and power. He was granted a palace in the mountains and archives where he could conduct his research, vast libraries filled with every scrap of knowledge that could be gathered, laboratories where he could experiment to his heart's content. For Seath had become obsessed with the immortality he had been denied at birth. He dedicated himself to discovering the secrets of eternal life through means other than the scales he lacked. He studied and experimented and researched with an intensity that bordered on madness, driving his servants to scour the world for knowledge and subjects for his experiments. Eventually, after untold years of work, he would find a primordial crystal, an artifact of immense power that granted him a form of immortality. It was not the clean, perfect immortality of the stone scales his brethren had possessed, but it kept him alive, kept him from dying, and that was enough. Or at least he told himself it was enough, even as his mind slowly fractured under the weight of his obsession. When the war finally ended, when the last of the everlasting dragons had fallen or fled into the deepest, darkest corners of the world to hide, when the corpses of dragons lay heaped upon the grey stone, and their blood ran in rivers across the ancient earth, the world was transformed utterly. The age of grey stasis was over, finished, consigned to memory and legend. The age of unchanging eternity had ended in fire and lightning and death. The archtrees still stood, those massive pillars that had held up the grey sky, but now they were just trees, impressive but no longer eternal, no longer the fundamental pillars of an unchanging world. The stone crags remained, jutting from the earth as they always had, but now they were just stone, no longer the foundation of an ageless realm, but simply geography. In the aftermath of the war, in the ruins of the world that had been, standing amid the corpses of dragons and the ashes of the old age, the lords built their kingdoms. This was the beginning of the age of fire, the age of gods and life and death, the age of change and story and meaning. No more grey, no more stasis. Now there was light and dark, heat and cold, life and death, all the disparities that the first flame had brought into being. Gwyn established his seat of power in a grand city that he named Anor Londo, the city of the gods. Here, high in the mountains where the sun seemed to shine eternal, he ruled as the Lord of Sunlight, the king of this new world. The city was a marvel of architecture and beauty, golden spires reaching toward the sky, grand halls and sweeping staircases, everything bathed in perpetual sunlight that seemed to emanate from Gwyn himself. It was a city worthy of gods, a place where the victors of the war against the dragons could rule in glory and splendour. Nito retreated to a place more suited to his nature, descending to the Tomb of the Giants, a massive catacomb deep beneath the earth, where he could administer death in solitude and darkness. He required no palace, no grand halls, just the quiet of the tomb where he could tend to the dead and fulfill his role as the first and greatest of reapers. In his domain, death was not terrifying but peaceful, a gentle return to the earth, and Nito presided over it with sombre dignity. The Witch of Izalith took her daughters to a place called Izalith, a city beneath the earth where they could tend their flames and create new life in the warmth of their fires. It was a place of molten rock and burning light, where the daughters of the witch could practice their flame sorcery and bring forth new creations. They were happy there, in their city of fire, creating and nurturing and building a civilization that would stand for ages. And the furtive pygmy, he disappeared from history entirely as if he had never been. While the other lords built their kingdoms and revelled in their power and shaped the world according to their visions, the pygmy and his descendants, humanity, spread quietly through the world like a subtle infection. They built smaller kingdoms, lived shorter lives, died, and were reborn in the cycle of life and death that the lords had created. They were so small, so insignificant compared to the gods who had overthrown the dragons. Surely they posed no threat. Surely they could be ignored, relegated to the footnotes of history, allowed to exist but not considered important. This would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, one that would have consequences reaching across all the ages to come. But that realization would not arrive until much later, when the first flame began to fade, and the gods realized too late what the darkness truly meant. what the descendants of the pygmy were capable of, what it meant that humanity carried within them fragments of the dark soul. By then, it would be too late to undo what had been done. The Age of Gods was glorious, but it was already built on foundations that would eventually crumble, already contained within it the seeds of its own inevitable end. For a time, perhaps a few centuries or perhaps 1,000 years, depending on how one measures time in an age that was still learning what time meant, it was glorious. The Age of Fire was everything the grey world had not been. There was warmth and cold, light and shadow, life that grew and died and grew again. There was change, constant and inevitable, the world transforming day by day in ways large and small. There was progress, each generation building on what came before, learning and creating and discovering. There was story, events that mattered, heroes and villains, victories and defeats, all the drama and beauty and tragedy that can only exist in a world where things can change. Anor Londo shone like a second sun on the mountaintop, a city of impossible beauty perched where mortals could barely breathe, its golden spires reaching toward the sky as if trying to touch the light itself. Gwyn ruled from his throne in the Great Hall, the Lord of Sunlight in his kingdom of perpetual day, his power seeming absolute, his age of fire seeming eternal. Everything the grey world had lacked, this new age possessed in overwhelming abundance. The city rang with the sounds of life, footsteps echoing in grand halls, voices raised in conversation and song, the clash of weapons in training yards, the music of celebration. After the eternal silence of the Age of Ancients, it was a symphony. Gwyn had 4 children, each remarkable in their own way, each touched by his divine power, but shaped by their own nature into something unique. His firstborn son was a god of war, a mighty warrior who wielded sunlight as his father did, who led the armies of the gods to victory after victory in the wars that followed the fall of the dragons. This son commanded lightning with a skill that rivaled Gwyn's own, could ride storms into battle, fought with a fury and skill that made him legendary among both gods and men. He was so honoured, so respected that statues were built in his image throughout Anor Londo, and his name was spoken with reverence throughout the land. But something happened. Some transgression so terrible that Gwyn, who loved his firstborn dearly, who had raised him to be the mightiest warrior in all the world, felt compelled to erase him from history. Gwyn struck his firstborn's name from all records, ordered the statues destroyed, commanded that no one speak of him again. The god of war became the nameless king, his very existence erased from official history for sins that were never recorded, never spoken of, never explained. Only much later, in ages when Anor Londo had fallen to ruin and Gwyn's laws no longer held absolute power, would the truth be rediscovered. The firstborn had betrayed his father by siding with the dragons, by choosing the old world over the new, by refusing to let the last remnants of the Age of Ancients die completely. Gwyn's daughter Guinevere was known as the Princess of Sunlight, a goddess of fertility and bounty whose very presence brought prosperity to the kingdom. She was said to be of unparalleled beauty, her form so magnificent that even the gods marvelled at it, and her image would become one of the most enduring symbols of Anor Londo's glory. She married the flame god Flann in a union that was celebrated throughout the kingdom, though whether this was love or political alliance, whether she chose it freely or was wed for reasons of state, the histories do not record. When the Age of Fire began to fade, when the light started to dim and the warmth began to cool, Guinevere would leave Anor Londo, abandoning her father's kingdom to its slow decline, fleeing to some distant land where perhaps the flame still burned bright. The youngest child was Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun, a child born under strange circumstances and cursed with an affinity for the moon rather than the sun. Due to this lunar nature, Gwyndolin was raised as a daughter rather than a son given domain over the dark moon and the night, rather than the sunlight and day, hidden away in the depths of Anor Londo rather than displayed proudly in its halls. Gwyndolin was frail and, in Gwyn's eyes, repulsive, everything a child of the Lord of Sunlight should not be. The youngest child should have been strong and radiant, should have blazed with solar power, should have embodied the light that Gwyn held so dear. Instead, Gwyndolin was pale and weak, associated with darkness rather than light, with the moon that merely reflected the sun's glory rather than the sun itself. But despite Gwyn's coldness, despite being relegated to the shadows and raised as something other than what he was, Gwyndolin was deeply devoted to his father. This devotion would lead him to maintain Gwyn's vision long after Gwyn himself was gone, to create elaborate illusions to hide the truth of Anor Londo's decay, to spend centuries alone in the abandoned city keeping up appearances so that travellers would still see the glory of the Age of Fire rather than its slow death. It was a lonely, thankless task, and Gwyndolin would perform it with unwavering dedication until the very end. Gwyn also had a third daughter, Filianor. Though little is known of her in these early ages, she would be sent far away to a place called the Ringed City at the very edge of the world to watch over something precious and dangerous, the concentration of humanity's dark soul that Gwyn feared so much. She would sleep there for untold ages, a seal against the dark, a guardian of secrets better left forgotten, sacrificing her life to serve her father's will even as he forgot about her in the grand halls of Anor Londo. Beyond his family, Gwyn commanded 4 knights of extraordinary skill, warriors so mighty that their names would echo through the ages long after they had fallen. These were his most trusted companions, the champions who had helped him overthrow the dragons and build his kingdom, and he honoured them with positions of immense responsibility and fragments of his own power. There was Ornstein the Dragon Slayer, captain of the 4 knights, wielder of lightning spears that could pierce dragon hide even after the war had ended. Ornstein had fought in the war against the dragons with skill and ferocity that made him legendary, and in the age that followed he continued to hunt down the few dragons that remained, ensuring that the old age could never return. He was devoted not just to Gwyn but to Gwyn's firstborn, following the god of war into battle after battle, learning to fight with lightning in imitation of his lord. When the firstborn was cast out, Ornstein remained loyal to Gwyn, but that loyalty was strained, and he would eventually leave Anor Londo to search for the nameless king. There was Artorias, the Abyss Walker, who would become perhaps the most legendary of all Gwyn's knights, though his legend would be built on lies and tragedy. Artorias fought against the spreading abyss, that terrible darkness that began to seep into the world as the flame grew weaker. He learned to walk through the abyss without being consumed by it, to fight creatures of pure darkness without losing himself to their corruption. He wielded a great sword as tall as a man, and carried a great shield that could block the abyss itself, and his skill was such that his name became synonymous with heroism. He had a loyal wolf companion named Sif, and together they would face horrors that would eventually break even Artorias' legendary will. There was Hawkeye Gorf, a giant of a man and a master archer who could shoot down dragons from impossible distances. Goff commanded the Dragon Slayers, the archers who had rained arrows down on the everlasting dragons during the war, finding the gaps between their scales and exploiting them with perfect precision. Despite his massive size, Guff was gentle and thoughtful, more likely to be found whittling small wooden carvings than boasting of his conquests. By the time the chosen undead would meet him in the past, Guff would be blind, his eyes filled with resin by those who feared his power, but even blind he could still shoot down a dragon with a single arrow, and there was Lord's Blade Kieran, a deadly assassin who fought with paired daggers and served as Gwyn's personal executioner. Where the other knights were celebrated publicly, their deeds sung in ballads, Kieran worked in the shadows, eliminating threats to Gwyn's rule before they could become public problems. She wore a mask of porcelain and moved like a shadow, and the only sound her victims heard was the whisper of her blades. She harboured feelings for Artorias, whether love or devotion, or something more complicated, and his fate would affect her deeply. These knights became heroes, their deeds celebrated throughout the land in songs and stories. They represented everything the Age of Fire was meant to be: noble, powerful, just. They were protectors of the light, warriors against the dark, the bulwark that stood between civilization and chaos. Mothers told their children stories of Artorias' bravery, of Ornstein's skill, of Guff's precision, of Kieran's loyalty. The four knights were symbols of Gwyn's power and righteousness, proof that the Age of Fire was not just sustainable but glorious. But like everything else in Gwyn's kingdom, their stories would not end well. The glory would fade, the light would dim, and even these legendary warriors would fall in ways that betrayed everything they had fought for. For a time, the Age of Fire flourished beyond anyone's wildest imaginings. Kingdoms rose throughout the world, each one reaching for greatness in its own way. Humans built their own civilizations in the shadow of the gods, cities and towns that grew and thrived in the warmth and light of the New Age. There was New Londo, a great city built on water, where four kings ruled with wisdom and power granted to them by Gwyn himself. There was the Kingdom of Balder, which produced knights, so skilled they were sought after throughout the world. There were countless smaller settlements, villages and outposts, all of them part of the great tapestry of life that had become possible only after the first flame drove away the grey. Anor Londo stood as the shining centre of it all, the seat of divine power, the guarantee that the light would never fade. Gwyn's Silver Knights patrolled the city and the lands around it, maintaining order, ensuring that the Age of Fire continued without interruption. The gods walked among mortals when they chose to, appearing at celebrations, blessing crops and children, accepting worship and tribute. It was an age of wonder and possibility. But the first flame that had brought all of this into being, that had ended the Age of Ancients and created this age of change and life, that flame was not eternal. It burned bright, yes, but all flames must eventually diminish. Flames need fuel, and even the first flame, powerful as it was, could not burn forever without something to feed it. And as the years passed, as centuries turned to millennia, the flame began to fade. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight dimming of the light in Anor Londo's halls, a subtle cooling of the warmth that had seemed to emanate from the city itself. The change was so gradual that most did not perceive it, did not understand that something fundamental was shifting. But Gwyn understood. Gwyn saw the flame weakening, felt its power ebbing, knew what this meant even before anyone else noticed. The primordial serpents, ancient beings as old as the flame itself, spoke to Gwyn of what was to come. They told him that after the Age of Fire must inevitably come an Age of Dark. The flame would fade, and in the darkness that followed, humanity would rise to claim their inheritance as bearers of the Dark Soul. The Age of Gods would end, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the simple, inevitable progression from light to dark, from fire to ash. It was the natural order, they said, the way things were meant to be. Gwyn could not accept this. He had built an entire world on the light of the first flame. His power, his kingdom, his very existence was predicated on the flame continuing to burn. An age of dark was unthinkable. It was the end of everything he had created, everything he had fought for, everything he was. The gods would fade into the darkness, becoming nothing but forgotten memories. The humans, those small, insignificant creatures with their tiny fragments of the dark soul, they would rise to prominence. They would inherit the world. And Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, would fade into nothing. He looked at the fading flame, felt it growing weaker year by year, and made a choice that would echo through all the ages to come. He would not let the flame die. No matter what it cost, no matter what sacrifices were required, no matter what consequences might follow, the Age of Fire must continue. He would find a way to rekindle the flame, to feed it, to keep it burning. And if that meant defying the natural order of things, if that meant creating a curse that would torment humanity for thousands of years, if that meant ultimately sacrificing himself and countless others, then so be it. The Age of Fire would not end. Not while Gwyn still drew breath. Not while he had the power to resist. He looked at the fading flame and made his choice, and that choice would shape every tragedy, every sacrifice, every moment of suffering that followed in all the long ages yet to come. The signs of the flame's decline became impossible to ignore, even for those who desperately wanted to believe otherwise. The great kingdom of Anor Londo, which had known nothing but perpetual sunlight since the moment of its founding, began to feel the cold creeping into its halls for the first time in its history. Shadows appeared in corners that had always been flooded with light. The perpetual golden glow that had shone from the city's towers started to dim, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as years passed into decades. The power of the gods began to wane, their miracles becoming less reliable, their presence among mortals growing more rare. And with the fading of the flame came something even worse, something more terrible than mere darkness, the spread of the abyss. The abyss was not simply darkness, not merely the absence of light. It was something older and deeper, the primordial dark that had existed before the first flame ignited, before disparity came into the world. It was the dark counterpart to the flame, the deep darkness that existed beneath all things, the fundamental nature of the dark soul given terrible form. Where the flame brought light and order and structure, the abyss brought chaos and corruption, and the dissolution of all forms into formless void. As the flame dimmed, as its power weakened, the abyss grew stronger, spreading like an infection through cracks in reality, consuming everything it touched. Where the abyss spread, life became twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. Humans who touched it became monstrous, their bodies and minds warped into nightmarish forms. The dark ran wild, refusing to be contained, refusing to acknowledge any authority or order, consuming and corrupting everything that tried to hold it back. In New Lundo, that great city built on water where 4 kings ruled with wisdom and power, granted by Gwyn himself, the abyss found purchase. The 4 kings had been loyal servants of Gwyn, had accepted fragments of his lord's soul, had ruled their city well for many years. But they were approached by Darkstalker Kati, one of the primordial serpents who whispered of the coming age of dark, of the power that humanity would wield when the flame finally died, of the futility of trying to preserve an age that was meant to end. The kings listened to Carter's words. In their ambition, or their desperation, or their simple desire to survive what seemed like the inevitable end of the Age of Fire, they allowed the abyss to enter their city, thinking they could control it, thinking they could harness its power for their own purposes. They were wrong, catastrophically, fatally wrong. The results were immediate and apocalyptic. The abyss erupted through New Londo like a plague, a tide of pure darkness that consumed everything in its path. The citizens of New Londo were transformed by contact with the abyss, their humanity running wild, their physical forms twisted into horrible, dark wraiths, beings of shadow who existed only to hunt other humans and devour their souls. These were not mindless monsters, but something worse. They retained enough intelligence to use weapons and tactics, enough humanity to remember what they had been, but they were driven by an insatiable hunger for souls that overrode everything else. The 4 kings themselves fell to the abyss, their forms growing massive and monstrous, their minds consumed by darkness. Where once they had been wise rulers, now they were beings of pure dark power, attacking anything that entered their domain with mindless fury, their original personalities and purposes completely obliterated. The gods looked at the corruption spreading through New Londo and made a terrible decision. The city could not be saved. The abyss could not be allowed to spread beyond its walls. There was only one solution, one way to contain the darkness and prevent it from consuming the entire world. They would seal New Londo completely, and to ensure the seal held, they would flood the entire city, drowning everyone inside. It was genocide committed in the name of containment, the murder of an entire city's population to prevent a greater catastrophe. The waters rushed in, filling the streets and homes, drowning the dark wraiths and the few surviving normal citizens alike, everyone trapped together in a watery grave. The city sank beneath the flood, its buildings preserved but empty, its people dead or transformed into undead husks that wandered the flooded ruins forever. And still the abyss remained, held back by the water but not destroyed, waiting in the depths for someone to drain the city and set it free again. Gwyn sent Artorias, his most trusted knight, to deal with the dark wraiths and the spreading abyss. Artorias descended into the darkness itself with his wolf companion Sif at his side, learning to walk through the abyss without being consumed by it, fighting dark wraiths and corrupted beings with skill and determination that became legendary. He wore armor blessed with special properties to resist the abyss, carried a great shield that could block even corruption itself. He became known as the Abyss Walker, the knight who could traverse the deepest darkness and emerge untainted. Artorias slew countless dark wraiths, pushed back the corruption wherever he found it, became a symbol of humanity's ability to resist the abyss through sheer force of will. Stories spread of his deeds, each one more impressive than the last, until Artorias' name became synonymous with heroism itself. But even Artorias could only contain the abyss, not truly stop it. He could hold back the tide for a while, buy time for the flame to burn a little longer, but the fundamental problem remained. As the flame faded, the abyss would grow stronger, and eventually even the mightiest knight would not be enough to hold it back. While Artorias fought the spreading darkness, the Witch of Izalith watched the first, flame dying, and decided to take drastic action. She had been there at the beginning, had claimed her Lord's soul from the first flame itself, had used its power to create life and warmth and beauty for ages beyond counting. She understood fire better than perhaps anyone except Gwyn himself. And she believed she could solve the problem that was slowly destroying the Age of Fire. If the first flame was dying, she would create a new one. She would use her Lord's soul, her mastery of flame sorcery perfected over centuries, her deep understanding of the nature of fire itself, to birth a second first flame that could replace the dying original. It was audacious, perhaps even hubris, but the witch was desperate. She could see what was coming, could feel the cold creeping in, could sense the world sliding toward an age of dark that she wanted no part of. She would create a new flame, and from that flame, the Age of Fire would be reborn, would continue forever, would never have to end. She gathered her daughters around her in Izalith, the city beneath the earth where they had practiced their craft for so long. She prepared the ritual carefully, drawing on all her knowledge, channeling all her power. She used her Lord's soul as the core, the seed from which the new flame would grow. Everything had to be perfect. One mistake could be catastrophic, but the witch was confident. She had commanded flame since the very beginning of the Age of Fire. She knew what she was doing. And then she performed the ritual, and everything went horrifically, catastrophically wrong. Instead of creating a new first flame, clean and pure and life-giving, the witch's magic spiraled out of control, birthing something twisted and wrong and terrible. The bed of chaos erupted from the earth where she stood, a horrible fusion of a life and flame gone mad, roots and fire and screaming souls twisted together into a nightmare made manifest. The witch herself was consumed in the initial explosion, transformed into a horrible root-bound insect-like creature at the heart of the chaos, her body twisted beyond recognition, her mind shattered by what she had become. Her daughters were caught in the catastrophe. Some were warped and changed, their beautiful forms twisted into demons of flame and fury. The youngest son, Ceaseless Discharge, who had been born with lava sores across his body, became a massive monster of molten rock and endless pain. Two of the daughters were absorbed into the bed of chaos itself, their souls used to anchor the nightmare in place. Gwyn and her sister became half woman, half spider monstrosities, beautiful above the waist but grotesque below. Only Gwyn, the eldest daughter, escaped by fleeing the city before the worst of the corruption could claim her, and from the bed of chaos poured demons, countless demons, monsters of fire and corruption that spread across the world, bringing destruction wherever they went. These were not natural creatures, but twisted mockeries of life, born from the chaos flame that the witch had accidentally created. They had no purpose except destruction, no goal except to spread the chaos that had birthed them. Some retained vestiges of intelligence, fragments of the souls that had been consumed in the creation of the bed of chaos, but most were mindless engines of destruction. The city of Izalith was consumed utterly, sinking into the earth, becoming lost Izalith, a hellish realm of lava and demons where nothing of the original beauty remained. The demons spread outward from the ruined city, a plague of fire and madness. Gwyn was forced to wage war against these new enemies, fighting to contain the demon threat, even as his power waned with the fading flame. Some of his knights fell in battle against the demons, others, like the Black Knights who accompanied Gwyn on his most desperate campaigns, were scorched by the chaos flame. Their beautiful silver armour turned black and smoking, their spirits bound, to wander eternally even after death. Everything was falling apart. New Londo was drowned and sealed, its population dead or worse than dead. Izalith was lost to chaos and demons. The abyss continued to spread despite Artorias' best efforts. The first flame kept fading, kept dimming, kept dying no matter what anyone did to preserve it. And through it all, Gwyn watched his kingdom crumbling, watched the Age of Fire slipping away despite all his power and will. He knew that time had run out. The flame would not last much longer. The attempts to save it had only created new disasters. If he wanted to preserve the Age of Fire, if he wanted to keep the light burning even a little longer, he would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. There was a way to rekindle the flame, a technique that had never been tried before but that might, just might, work. The flame needed fuel. It needed power to burn, needed souls to consume to keep going. And what greater fuel could there be than a Lord's soul itself? What more powerful sacrifice than the Lord of Sunlight burning himself to rekindle the light he held so dear? Gwyn made his preparations slowly and carefully. He divided what remained of his Lord's soul among his children and his most loyal followers, ensuring that his power would continue even after he was gone. He took his most faithful knights, the Black Knights, who had served him since the war against the dragons, and led them to the kiln of the first flame, the place where the original flame still burned, dim but not yet extinguished. And there, in the kiln, surrounded by the heat of the dying flame and the ashes of everything that had burned before, Gwyn made his choice. He would sacrifice himself. He would burn his soul, his very essence, his entire being to rekindle the first flame. It would not be permanent. He knew that. The flame would fade again eventually, but it would buy time. It would extend the Age of Fire. It would delay the inevitable Age of Dark for another span of years or centuries. Gwyn stepped into the flame. The Black Knights who had accompanied him were consumed instantly, their bodies burned to nothing in a flash of heat so intense it stripped flesh from bone and bone from existence, leaving only their spirits scorched and scattered, bound to wander the world as hollow shells of what they had been. But Gwyn had enough power to survive, at least partially. He became the first Lord of Cinder, a hollow shell of his former self, his body burned and charred beyond recognition, his mind nearly gone, consumed by the act of relinking the flame, but his duty remaining. He would guard the flame, he would keep it burning. And when it began to fade again, another would come, another would sacrifice themselves, and the cycle would continue. Gwyn had found his solution, not through victory or wisdom, but through eternal sacrifice, an endless cycle of burning souls to feed a flame that could never be truly satisfied. It was desperate, it was unsustainable. But it bought time, and time was all Gwyn had left to give. But Gwyn's sacrifice came with a cost he had not anticipated, a side effect of relinking the flame that would create suffering on a scale that dwarfed even the flooding of New Londo, to ensure that there would always be fuel for the flame, to guarantee that humanity would continue to offer itself up as kindling for ages to come. A curse was born into the world, the Undead curse. Humans began to be marked with a dark sign, a brand that appeared on their skin like a ring of fire, marking them as cursed. The undead could not truly die. When they fell in battle or succumbed to disease or simply grew too old to continue, they would resurrect at bonfires scattered throughout the world, their bodies restored but their memories slowly fading, their souls slowly diminishing. With each death and resurrection, they lost a little more of themselves. Their humanity would drain away bit by bit until eventually they became hollow, mindless shells driven only by base instinct, attacking anything that moved, no longer truly alive but unable to die. This was the hidden price of extending the Age of Fire. Humanity became bound to the flame, cursed to serve as eternal kindling, driven slowly mad by their immortality. They would be drawn to the flame eventually, compelled to throw themselves into it, to burn their souls to keep the Age of Fire going just a little longer. And the gods told them it was a blessing, told them they were chosen, told them to sacrifice themselves for the good of the world, never mentioning that they were the reason the curse existed in the first place. The undead curse spread slowly at first, then faster still, until entire populations were marked. Those who bore the dark sign were driven from their homes, locked away in asylums and prisons, treated as monsters because eventually, inevitably, they would go hollow. The living feared the undead, and the undead feared what they were becoming, and still the curse spread, and still the flame kept demanding more fuel. Gwyn had saved the Age of Fire, but at a cost that even he, in his desperation, might not have accepted if he had known. The world would continue in light for ages to come, but it would be a light built on endless suffering, on curse and sacrifice, and the slow death of mind and soul. The Age of Fire would limp along, sustained by sacrifice after sacrifice, kingdom after kingdom, hero after hero, burning themselves to buy just a little more time. And each cycle would be shorter than the last. Each relinking would buy less time, and still the sacrifices would continue because no one could imagine any other way. Before we continue deeper into this tale of fading flames and cursed souls, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this journey through the lore of Dark Souls, if these words are helping you drift into sleep or simply keeping you company in the quiet hours, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means everything and helps me create more of these deep dives into gaming lore. There's so much more darkness to explore together, so many more stories waiting to be told. Now let's return to our tale, because we're about to enter one of the most tragic chapters in all of Dark Souls, the fall of Oolacile, and the creation of the Father of the Abyss. Centuries before, the chosen undead would wake in the undead asylum, in an age when Anor Londo still shone with something approaching its original brilliance. There existed a kingdom called Oolacile. It was a place unlike any other in Lordran, a kingdom dedicated not to conquest or trade or political power, but to the pursuit of knowledge itself. This was a land of sorcerers and scholars, where magic was studied not as a tool of war but as an art form worthy of lifelong devotion, where mages delved into the mysteries of light and soul and the strange space between worlds with the dedication of artists perfecting their craft. The people of Oolacile lived in beautiful gardens and ancient structures that seemed to grow from the earth rather than being built upon it. Massive stone towers rose among flowering trees, libraries filled with tomes bound in leather and gilded with gold held knowledge accumulated over generations, and throughout it all flowed a sense of peace and contemplation, rarely found in the harsh world of Lordran. Princess Dusk ruled Oolacile with wisdom and grace, beloved by her people, respected by neighbouring kingdoms. Under her gentle guidance, Oolacile prospered in quiet contentment, far from the conflicts that plagued the rest of the world. The sorcerers of Oolacile had developed their own unique approach to magic, distinct from the miracles of the gods or the pyromancy of Izalith. They wielded light magic, creating constructs of pure radiance, crafting weapons from solidified moonlight, manipulating the very fabric of space to achieve effects that seemed like miracles to those who did not understand the underlying principles. Their magic was beautiful and elegant, more concerned with understanding than with destruction, though it could be deadly when necessary. But Oolacile harboured a secret, a darkness buried so deep beneath the kingdom that most who lived there had forgotten it existed. Deep under the earth, far below the gardens and towers and libraries, there was a grave, a burial site marked with ancient stones worn smooth by unimaginable age, a resting place for something that should never have been disturbed. This was the tomb of a primeval human, one of the very first of humanity, possibly even the furtive pygmy himself, though this was never confirmed and would likely never be known for certain. Whatever this being had been in life, in death it had been sealed away with great care and marked with warnings in languages so old they could no longer be read. It had lain there undisturbed for untold ages, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through wars and peace, through the slow progression of the Age of Fire. The people of Oolacile, if they knew of the grave at all, knew only that it was ancient and sacred and should be left alone. Then came the serpent. One of the primordial serpents, those ancient beings as old as the first flame itself, appeared before the sorcerers of Oolacile with honeyed words and tempting suggestions. Whether it was Frampt the King-Seeker or Kati the Darkstalker, whether it acted from malice or from some incomprehensible agenda of its own, the serpent whispered to the scholars of power buried beneath their feet, of secrets hidden in their darkness, of knowledge that could be theirs if they were brave enough to claim it. This serpent told them they should excavate the grave, should study what lay beneath, should awaken the ancient human and learn from it. Think of what they might discover, the serpent said. Think of the knowledge that could be gained from one of the very first of humanity, from a being that had existed when the world was new and the first flame still burned bright. The secrets of the dark soul itself might be theirs to unlock. How could they call themselves seekers of knowledge if they turned away from such an opportunity? The sorcerers listened. Perhaps they were curious, driven by the same scholarly instinct that had led them to study magic in the first place. Perhaps they were ambitious, hoping to surpass the achievements of previous generations. Perhaps they simply wanted to push the boundaries of knowledge further than anyone had before, to make discoveries that would echo through the ages. Whatever their motivation, they made the decision that would doom their entire kingdom. They dug up the grave. They found the primeval human, this ancient thing that had lain dormant for ages beyond counting, its body preserved by magics older than Oolacile itself. And they began their experiments. They tortured it, trying to unlock its secrets through pain and suffering. They took something precious from it, a pendant that it had treasured, a small golden locket that seemed ordinary but that meant everything to this being. They drove it to madness with their tortures and their theft, pushed it beyond endurance, broke something fundamental within it, and then it woke. Manus, Father of the Abyss. When the primeval human's humanity went wild, when its soul expanded in agony and rage and loss and grief, when the dark soul fragment within it erupted outward in a wave of pure darkness, it birthed something terrible beyond words. The abyss itself, that deep darkness that existed before light, exploded from the depths like a tide of corruption, a wave of pure void that consumed everything it touched. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The citizens of Oolacile were driven mad by contact with the abyss, their humanity running wild within them, their physical forms twisting and changing into grotesque parodies of what they had been. The beautiful gardens became nightmarish tangles of corrupted plants that moved and grasped with terrible purpose. The ancient structures warped and twisted, their elegant lines becoming jagged and wrong. The peaceful kingdom fell in days, perhaps even hours, its beauty and learning obliterated, its people transformed into mindless beasts or worse. Manus himself became a horror beyond comprehension, his form growing massive and monstrous, a towering thing of darkness and fury with a bloated body and impossibly long arms that ended in grasping hands. He was driven by a single obsession, finding his pendant, the precious thing that had been stolen from him. He raged through Oolacile, searching desperately for what he had lost, and his power was immense, godlike in its scope. He could reach through time and space itself, could pull things from different eras into his domain, could warp reality around him. He took Princess Dusk, pulling her from her gardens into the heart of his domain, perhaps seeing in her something that reminded him of what he sought, perhaps simply taking her because he could. And his influence spread outward from Oolacile like ripples in a pond, threatening to consume not just the kingdom but all the lands around it. Gwyn, still mighty in those days, though his flame was already beginning to fade, received word of the catastrophe unfolding in Oolacile and sent his best knight to deal with it. Artorias the Abyss Walker, the one who had fought the dark wraiths of New Londo, the one who had learned to walk through darkness without being consumed. If anyone could stop Manus and save Oolacile, it would be Artorias. He took his loyal wolf companion Sif, just a pup but already showing the strength and courage that would make him legendary, and descended into the corrupted kingdom, determined to stop the Father of the Abyss and save what could be saved. But Artorias had never faced anything like Manus. The dark wraiths of New Londo, the spreading corruption of the Abyss in other places, these were terrible, but they were manageable. Manus was something else entirely. This was the Abyss in its primal form, raw and terrible and overwhelming, the Father of the Abyss himself, a being whose power rivaled that of the gods. Artorias fought with everything he had, Wielding his great sword with legendary skill, using his great shield to block, the darkness itself calling upon all his experience and training and sheer force of will. It was not enough. Manus shattered Artorias' shield arm with a single blow, breaking bone and armour alike, nearly ripping the limb from his body. The knight staggered, tried to fight on, but Manus was too strong, too fast, too utterly overwhelming. The abyss began to corrupt Artorias, seeping into him through his wounds, whispering promises of power, offering to make him strong enough to win if only he would surrender to the darkness. In his last moments of clarity, as the abyss began to consume his mind and soul, Artorias did the only thing he could. He used his great shield, broken as it was, to protect Sif, creating a barrier of light that the abyss could not penetrate. He saved his companion, ensured that at least the wolf would survive even if he himself was doomed. And then the darkness took him completely. Artorias the Abyss Walker became a corrupted shell, a beast of the abyss wearing the armour of a legendary hero. His legendary skill remained, but now it was turned to the service of the darkness he had fought his entire life. He wandered the ruins of Oolacile, attacking anything that moved with mindless fury. His movements still graceful and deadly, but driven by corruption rather than purpose. He was a tragic monument to the power of the abyss, proof that even the mightiest knight, even the strongest will, could be broken by the deep darkness. The legend would say that Artorias eventually defeated Manus and saved Princess Dusk before succumbing to his wounds, dying a hero's death with his duty fulfilled. This is what history would record. This is the tale told in songs and written in books. The truth, as so often in Dark Souls, was more complicated and more heartbreaking. Far in the future, the chosen undead would find Manus's broken pendant, a small golden locket lying forgotten in a corner of the Duke's archives, and when they touched it, Manus's power would activate, reaching across centuries, pulling the chosen undead back through time itself, dragging them into Oolacile at the height of its fall. The undead would arrive in the past and find a kingdom in ruins, a legendary knight corrupted beyond saving, and a monster that threatened to destroy everything. It was the chosen undead who fought through the corrupted Oolacile, who cut a path through the twisted citizens and horrible monsters that had once been people. It was they who faced the possessed Artorias in the Royal Colosseum, who fought the legendary knight in his corrupted state and put him out of his misery, giving him the death he should have had. It was they who descended into the chasm of the abyss, into the deepest darkness where Manus raged and searched for his lost pendant, and it was they who fought the Father of the Abyss in a desperate battle. The fight against Manus was one of the most terrifying encounters in all of Dark Souls. The Father of the Abyss was massive and impossibly powerful, his long arms sweeping across the arena with crushing force, his dark magic filling the air with deadly projectiles. He could summon rains of dark energy, could create explosions of void, could strike with physical blows that could shatter stone. The arena itself was a nightmare surrounded by the abyss, with no escape except victory or death. When the chosen undead finally defeated Manus, when they shattered the primeval human soul and rescued Princess Dusk from the darkness, history repeated its earlier pattern. When Dusk was rescued, when she was brought back to the surface, she was confused and barely conscious. The other survivors of Oolacile, the few who had escaped the worst of the corruption, told her that Artorias had saved her. They assumed it was true because Artorias was the hero who had been sent to save them, the legendary knight whose name everyone knew. The chosen undead, as always, remained anonymous, unknown, a traveller who arrived and departed, without leaving their name in the histories. So Artorias' legend remained intact, even grew stronger. History recorded that he defeated Manus and saved Oolacile before dying from his wounds, dying as a hero, his reputation unsullied. The truth that he fell to the abyss, that he became a corrupted monster, that it was someone else who actually saved the day, all of that was forgotten or never known. Only Sif knew the truth, and when the chosen undead would later encounter the Great Wolf in their own time, Sif would recognize them, would remember the one who had saved him in the past when Artorias could not. But even that recognition would not be enough to prevent the sad necessity of their battle. Manus's soul, when it shattered, did not simply dissipate into nothing. The fragments of the dark soul, tainted now by Manus's rage and madness, and the deep corruption of the abyss itself, scattered across time and space. These fragments would eventually coalesce into sentient beings, each one a child of dark, each one carrying a part of Manus's nature and his obsessions. They would appear in different lands and different ages, drawn to power, seeking to fill the void within themselves, bringing ruin wherever they went, though they did not necessarily mean to. Oolacile was lost utterly and completely. The kingdom was consumed by the abyss, its beauty turned to nightmare, its people transformed into monsters. In the future, nothing would remain but ruins overgrown with vegetation, a forgotten kingdom where no one even remembered the name. The land would become Darkroot Garden, a place of mystery and danger, where a great wolf guarded a grave that no one understood the significance of, where the ghosts of old warriors still fought battles long since ended, where the very earth was scarred by what had happened there. The tragedy of Oolacile was a warning that went unheeded. It showed what could happen when humanity's darkness was pushed too far, when the dark soul was driven to madness. It demonstrated the power of the abyss when it erupted in full force, the corruption that could spread from a single point of origin to consume entire kingdoms. But the lesson was lost because the truth was buried, because the legend of Artorias' heroism was more comforting than the reality of his fall, because no one wanted to acknowledge that even the mightiest could be broken by the darkness. And so the Age of Fire stumbled on, weaker now, more damaged, but still refusing to die. The flames still burned, though dimmer than before. The gods still ruled, though their power waned with each passing year. And in the dark places of the world, in the depths where light never reached, the abyss waited patiently, growing stronger as the flame grew weaker, knowing that its time would come eventually, that the Age of Dark could not be delayed forever, no matter how many sacrifices were made to preserve the light. 1,000 years passed after Gwyn's sacrifice, or perhaps it was only centuries, or perhaps it was longer. Time had begun to behave strangely in Lordran, becoming fluid and unreliable, flowing differently in different places, sometimes seeming to fold back on itself. This was one of the effects of the flames fading, one of the signs that the Age of Fire was coming to an end no matter how many times it was rekindled. The very fabric of reality was fraying, coming apart at the seams, and time was one of the first casualties of that unravelling. What is certain is that the Age of Fire continued, but it was a pale shadow of what it had once been. Anor Londo stood empty, its gods departed to places unknown or simply faded away as their power diminished. The grand halls echoed with silence. The beautiful chambers sat vacant. The only sound was the wind through empty corridors and the slow drip of water where rain had leaked through roofs that no one maintained anymore. Only Gwyndolin remained, the dark sun, the youngest and least favoured of Gwyn's children, hiding in the depths of the city and maintaining elaborate illusions to hide the decay. He created a false Guinevere, a projection of the goddess of fertility who would greet those who came seeking the gods and direct them toward their destiny. He maintained an illusion of sunlight over Anor Londo, hiding the fact that the perpetual day had ended, that shadows now filled the halls, that the golden age was over. He did this alone, out of devotion to his father, out of belief in the age of fire, out of refusal to let the dream die, even though the reality had long since faded. Throughout the world, the undead curse spread like a plague that could not be stopped. More and more humans bore the dark sign in increasing numbers, driven from their homes when their curse was discovered, locked away in asylums and prisons, treated as monsters because eventually, inevitably, they would go hollow, they would slowly lose, their minds piece by piece with each death and resurrection, their memories fading like old parchment left in the sun, their souls diminishing like candles burning down to nothing until they became violent and dangerous, attacking anything that moved, no longer truly alive but unable to die. The living feared the undead, and the undead feared what they were becoming. Communities fell apart when the curse appeared among them. Families were torn apart when one of their own was marked with the dark sign. The curse did not discriminate, did not care about rank or virtue or achievement. Knight and beggar alike could be marked, scholar and soldier, young and old, and all would eventually go hollow if they could not find purpose, if they gave up hope, if they surrendered to despair. In the northern lands, far from Anor Londo, there stood an asylum built specifically to house the undead. It was a place of cold stone and colder purpose, a fortress prison where the cursed were locked away to await their inevitable hollowing. The asylum was built on a cliff overlooking a grey sea, isolated and inescapable, staffed by guards who viewed their charges with a mixture of pity and disgust. This was where the cursed came to die slowly, to go mad in solitude, to transform into hollows far from anyone who might remember them as they had been. And there, in a cell deep in the asylum, an undead woke up. This was the chosen undead, though they did not know they were chosen yet, did not know they were special in any way. They knew only that they were cursed, that they were imprisoned, that they were seemingly forgotten. They had no memory of how they had come to be there, no clear understanding of what they had been before the curse, just the knowledge that they were undead and therefore doomed to eventually go hollow. But a mysterious figure appeared in the asylum with purpose and intention. Oscar, Knight of Astora, a noble warrior seeking the chosen undead who would succeed Lord Gwyn. Oscar had followed a prophecy, had believed that someone cursed and imprisoned in this forsaken place would be the one destined to rekindle the first flame and save the Age of Fire. He found the right cell and dropped a corpse through the ceiling, a corpse that carried a key that would allow the chosen undead to escape their imprisonment. The chosen undead took the key and unlocked their cell, stepping out into the asylum for the first time. They fought through hollows that had once been other prisoners, their minds already gone, their bodies moving on instinct and rage. They climbed through the asylum, learning to fight, learning to survive, discovering that death was not the end, that they would resurrect at bonfires scattered throughout the world, restored but diminished. They encountered Oscar again, this time fatally wounded by the asylum demon, a massive creature that served as the final guardian preventing escape. With his dying breath, Oscar gifted the chosen undead his Estus flask, a miraculous container of healing liquid that would sustain them on their journey, and he told them of their destiny. They were to go to Lordran to ring the bells of awakening, to seek the Lord Vessel and gather the Lord's souls. They were to go to the kiln of the first flame and succeed Lord Gwyn, linking the fire and extending the Age of Fire once more. It was a destiny written by the gods, a prophecy crafted by Gwyndolin and the primordial serpent Frampt, to ensure that another sacrifice would come to feed the flame. The chosen undead was being manipulated from the very beginning, though they did not know it yet. They were being led by carefully placed clues and helpful advice toward a fate that had been decided for them before they even woke in their cell. The prophecy was not a prediction of what would happen, but a plan for what the gods wanted to happen, a script written to ensure the Age of Fire would continue. But the chosen undead newly escaped from their cell did not yet understand any of this. They only knew they had a purpose, a goal, something to strive for that might keep them from going hollow. And so they fought the asylum demon, either defeating it immediately through skill and determination, or fleeing from it to find better weapons and return stronger. Either way, they claimed victory, took the key that would let them leave the asylum, and rang the bell that summoned a giant raven to carry them away from that place of imprisonment. The raven brought them to Lordran, to the Firelink Shrine, a place of rest where a bonfire burned eternally, and a melancholy firekeeper tended it without speaking, without raising her eyes, without offering any comfort beyond the presence of the flame. From this central hub, the chosen undead's journey truly began. They had to ring 2 bells, one in a church high above in the undead parish, one in a fortress of demons deep below in the ruins of Blight Town. These bells would open the path to Sen's fortress, a deadly gauntlet designed to test those who would seek the gods, a nightmare of swinging blades and crushing boulders and narrow walkways suspended above bottomless drops. The journey was brutal in ways that went beyond mere physical difficulty. The chosen undead died countless times, resurrecting at bonfires, losing the souls they had collected, fighting their way through hordes of hollows and demons and monsters that seemed specifically designed to crush hope. They rang the first bell in the undead parish, fighting through the church and its corrupted clergy, defeating the bell gargoyles atop the roof. They descended into the depths, a sewer system beneath Undead Burg filled with cursed creatures and toxic waste, fought through Blight Town's poisoned swamps and twisted platforms, and finally rang the second bell in Quelag's domain, defeating the spider woman who guarded it. The bells rang, their sound echoing across Lordran, and in response the massive iron gate blocking Sen's fortress rose for the first time in living memory. The chosen undead entered that nightmare of traps and monsters, climbing higher and higher through mechanisms designed to kill, until they reached the top and faced the iron golem, a massive automaton guarding the path to Anor Londo. When the iron golem fell, when the chosen undead stood victorious atop Sen's fortress, winged demons appeared and carried them over the mountains to the legendary city of the gods. And Anor Londo was beautiful beyond words, a golden city bathed in sunlight that seemed to come from nowhere, towers reaching toward the sky, the architecture of a civilization at its peak, preserved perfectly as if time had no power here. But it was also empty. No gods walked these halls anymore. No citizens filled these streets. It was a museum, a monument to past glory maintained by illusion and the devotion of one lonely child of Gwyn. The chosen undead walked through silent chambers, fought past silver knights who still patrolled their posts centuries after their purpose had ended, and eventually made their way to the cathedral at the city's heart. There they met Gwyndolin's projection of Guinevere, massive and beautiful and utterly false, who told them they were chosen by prophecy. She gave them the Lord Vessel, a sacred container capable of holding Lord souls, and told them what they must do. They must fill it with the souls of the mighty. Nito, first of the dead, the witch of Izalith, or what remained of her in the bed of chaos, Seath the Scaleless, who had betrayed the dragons, and the 4 kings of New Londo, who had fallen to the abyss. Only by gathering these souls could the path to the kiln of the first flame be opened. Only then could the chosen undead attempt to succeed Gwyn and link the fire as they were prophesied to do. But at this point a choice presented itself. Though many who reached this far never knew it existed, the chosen undead could follow a different path if they broke Gwyndolin's illusion. If they saw through the lies and attacked the false Guinevere, the sunlight would fade from Aenor Londo, revealing it as the dark, empty ruin it truly was. And they might encounter Darkstalker Caerthe, a primordial serpent who offered a different version of events, a different interpretation of the prophecy. Caerthe told the truth that Frampt and Gwendolyn had hidden, that Gwyn feared the Age of Dark, that he had created the undead curse to bind humanity to the flame, that the natural order was for fire to fade and for the age of humans to begin. Caerthe offered an alternative. Instead of linking the fire, become the Dark Lord, let the flame die, usher in the age that had been denied for so long, end the cycle of sacrifice and let humanity claim its birthright. But most who came this far, most who had struggled through everything to reach Aenor Londo, simply followed the path laid out for them. They gathered the Lord's souls, fighting through nightmares to claim each one. They descended into the Tomb of the Giants, a vast catacomb filled with darkness so complete that sight itself became useless, fighting through giant skeletons and worse to reach Nito in his burial chamber. They entered Lost Izalith, that hellish realm of lava and demons, and destroyed the bed of chaos, ending the witch's torment at last. They climbed the Duke's archives, Seath's library and laboratory, and slew the mad dragon who had betrayed his kind. They flooded New Londo, draining the city that had been submerged for centuries, and descended into the abyss itself to fight the 4 kings, those corrupted rulers who had fallen to darkness. Each battle was desperate and deadly, each journey a nightmare of its own. But the chosen undead prevailed through skill or persistence or sheer stubborn refusal to give up. They filled the Lord Vessel with the soul of the mighty, and in doing so opened the path to the kiln of the first flame. They descended through the kiln, through tunnels of ash and monuments to dead kingdoms, past the remnants of everything that had burned to fuel the flame, and at the centre, at the heart of the dying first flame itself, they found what remained of Lord Gwyn. He was barely recognisable as the mighty god he had once been. The fire had consumed him completely, burned away everything but the husk, leaving a hollow shell that still defended the flame even though Gwyn's mind was long gone. Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, was now just Gwyn the Hollow, a burned-out remnant of godhood that attacked immediately when the chosen undead approached, wielding his flaming sword with desperate fury. The battle was tragic beyond words. This was the Lord of Sunlight, the one who had overthrown the dragons, who had built an age, who had sacrificed himself for his vision of eternal light. And now he was this, a mindless guardian, a burned-out shell, attacking anyone who approached the flame regardless of their intent or whether they came to help or harm. There was no recognition in his hollow eyes, no honor in his movements, just an animalistic drive to protect the flame he had given everything to preserve. The chosen undead fought him among the ashes of his sacrificed knights, in the heart of the kiln where reality itself seemed to burn. And when they struck him down, when they claimed his soul, when Gwyn fell to his knees and dissolved into nothing, the flame lay before them, dying but not yet dead, waiting for the choice that would determine its fate and the fate of the world. Link the fire, sacrifice yourself just as Gwyn had, burn your soul to rekindle the flame and extend the age of fire for another uncertain span of time. You would become a Lord of Cinder yourself, fuel for the flame, your duty fulfilled. The cycle would continue. Another kingdom would rise, another would fall, and eventually another undead would wake to do what you had done, or walk away. Let the flame die. Let the darkness come. Become the Dark Lord that Gwyn had feared so much, usher in the age of dark that had been delayed for so long. It might be humanity's time to shine, or it might be apocalypse. No one knew. The gods had ensured that no one would ever know because they had prevented the Age of Dark from ever beginning. The game never tells you which choice is correct. There is no good ending or bad ending, just choices and their consequences. Either way, the cycle would continue. Even if the chosen undead let the flame die, eventually someone else would rekindle it. Even if they linked it, eventually it would fade again. The fundamental problem was not solved. The cycle was not broken, and in distant lands, in places far from Lordran, kingdoms rose and fell, and each time they rose they faced the same question, the same choice, the same impossible decision. Untold ages passed. The kingdom of Lordran faded into legend, and then beyond legend into myth, and then beyond myth into vague stories that no one quite believed anymore. The very name was forgotten. The places where great deeds had been done crumbled to dust and blew away on the wind. New kingdoms rose in new lands, built on the ruins of kingdoms that had come before, themselves destined to become ruins for the kingdoms that would come after. The cycle of flame and dark repeated endlessly, each iteration requiring a new sacrifice, each time extending the Age of Fire just a little longer before it faded again and required another rekindling. And each time the cycle repeated, the world became a little more worn, a little more tired, a little more hollow. The cracks in reality grew wider. Time became even more fluid and unreliable. The barriers between past and present began to break down. In a land far to the south of where Lordran had once stood, a new kingdom rose called Drangleic. Its founder was King Vendrick, a mighty warrior who had conquered the previous kingdom that stood in that place, whose name was already forgotten, and built something greater from its ruins. Vendrick was determined and ambitious, possessed of a vision for a kingdom that could endure when all others had fallen. a realm that might finally break the cycle of rise and fall that had plagued every kingdom since the beginning of the Age of Fire. Vendrick had a brother named Aldia, a scholar obsessed with understanding the curse, with finding a way to break the cycle that had bound humanity for so many ages. Where Vendrick built his power through conquest and governance, Aldia built his through research and experimentation, delving into the darkest secrets of souls and curses and the fundamental nature of the world itself. Together, they dreamed of creating something that would last, something that would not fade and fall like everything else. The kingdom of Drangleic prospered for a time. Vendrick's rule was strong and his people thrived under his protection. The capital city of Drangleic grew magnificent, its castle a wonder of architecture rising from the landscape like a crown of stone. Trade flourished. The arts bloomed. It seemed, for a while, that Vendrick might actually succeed in creating something enduring. Then she arrived from across the sea. Her name was Nashandra, and she was beautiful beyond measure, mysterious and alluring in ways that captivated Vendrick from the moment he saw her. She came with warnings of a great threat from the giants who lived across the ocean, told him that they possessed something of great power that Drangleic needed to defend itself, that they would invade if Vendrick did not strike first. She spoke with such conviction, such apparent concern for Drangleic's safety, that Vendrick believed her without question. Vendrick loved his queen. He trusted her completely. When she warned him of danger, he acted. He gathered his armies, built a fleet, and crossed the sea to the land of the giants. The war that followed was brutal and bloody. Vendrick's forces fought the giants in their own land, pillaging and conquering, taking something from them, though what exactly he stole was never entirely clear. Some say it was a great soul, some say it was ancient knowledge, some say it was the giants themselves, prisoners who would be brought back to Drangleic for Aldia's experiments. But the giants did not forget. They were patient, but implacable. They built their own fleet, massive vessels that could carry their enormous forms across the ocean, and they came to Drangleic seeking vengeance for what had been stolen, for the invasion of their homeland, for the deaths of their kin. The war that followed devastated Vendrick's kingdom more thoroughly than any conquest could have. The giants were enormous and terrifyingly powerful, their very presence shaking the earth. They smashed through Drangleic's defences like paper, their massive stone weapons crushing buildings and soldiers alike. Vendrick fought desperately to defend his realm, creating golems from the giants he had captured, turning his brother's experiments into soldiers for the war effort. The golems fought the living giants in battles that destroyed entire regions of Drangleic, leaving nothing but scorched earth and broken stone. The war ground on for years, each side inflicting terrible casualties on the other. Drangleic bled and burned. Its people suffered beyond measure. Cities were reduced to rubble. Fields became battlegrounds. And even though the giants were eventually driven back, even though Vendrick's forces managed to win through sheer desperation and sacrifice, the kingdom was broken. The victory was hollow. Drangleic had survived, but it was mortally wounded, its strength spent, its future uncertain. And then the curse came. The undead curse that had plagued humanity since Gwyn's time spread through Drangleic like wildfire. People began bearing the dark sign in numbers that overwhelmed the kingdom's ability to deal with them. They began losing their minds, began hollowing, began attacking their own families and neighbours as the curse stripped away their humanity piece by piece. Vendrick tried everything he could think of to stop it. He sought out great souls, hoping their power could shield his kingdom from the curse. He built fortresses and barriers to contain the spread. He sent the cursed far away to a place called the Shrine of Amana, a beautiful but isolated region where they could be separated from the general population. He poured resources into finding a cure, supporting his brother Aldia's increasingly desperate experiments. But nothing worked. The curse was unstoppable, inevitable, spreading through his kingdom no matter what he did. And then Vendrick finally realized the truth about his beloved queen. Nashandra was no ordinary woman. She was a child of dark, a fragment of Manus's shattered soul that had gained consciousness and form. Everything she had done, every word she had spoken had been manipulation. She had drawn him to her because she was attracted to his powerful soul like a moth to flame. She had sent him to war with the giants to weaken his kingdom and strengthen her own position. She had brought the curse to Drangleic, or at least accelerated its spread. She wanted the throne not to rule, but to claim its power, to feed the hunger that drove all the children of dark. Vendrick understood that he had been played for a fool from the very beginning. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, had been part of Nashandra's design. His kingdom was crumbling not because of mistakes he had made, but because he had been manipulated into making them. The war with the giants, the spread of the curse, the weakening of Drangleic, all of it had served Nashandra's purposes. In his despair, Vendrick refused to take the throne, refused to link the fire, refused to play the role that had been written for him. Instead, he walked into the undead crypt deep beneath his castle and began to hollow. He did not die, but he stopped living, wandering in circles in the dark, his mind slowly fragmenting, his humanity slowly draining away. He became just another hollow in the darkness, powerful still but mindless, waiting for an end that would not come. This was the kingdom that greeted the bearer of the curse, the protagonist of Dark Souls 2. Like the chosen undead before them, they were cursed with the dark sign, slowly losing their humanity with each death. But unlike the chosen undead, they came to Drangleic not to link the fire but seeking a cure, searching for some way to break the curse, to stop the hollowing, to remain themselves even as the world fell apart around them. The bearer of the curse travelled through Drangleic's ruins, through its crumbling castles and twisted forests, through its shrines and crypts and fortresses. They encountered the remnants of Vendrick's kingdom, the knights who still defended it though it had already fallen, the cursed who had been cast out and forgotten, the scholars who sought understanding even as their minds fractured. And everywhere they went they learned the same lesson. There is no cure. The curse cannot be broken. The cycle continues, over and over, and no one has found a way to escape it. The bearer of the curse fought through the ruins and gathered the great souls that held the key to Drangleic's throne. They faced the four lords that held the greatest souls in this kingdom, the lost sinner, trapped in a tower and chained as punishment for attempting to recreate the Chaos Flame, the old Iron King, whose kingdom had sunk into lava when his greed and ambition consumed him, the Rotten, a mass of tortured souls merged together in the depths, and Duke's dear Freya, a massive spider infected by a fragment of Seath's soul, guarding the knowledge of the Paldrake in Seldora. Each of these lords represented a different failure, a different way that kingdoms and rulers had fallen throughout the ages. The lost sinner had tried to recreate the Witch of Izalith's experiment and suffered similar consequences. The old Iron King had been consumed by his desire for power and flame. The rotten embodied the accumulation of all the discarded and forgotten souls that the world had cast aside. Freya showed how even Seath's madness and obsession continued to poison the world ages after his death. The bearer of the curse found Vendrick in the Undead crypt, discovered the Hollow King wandering mindlessly in the dark, his crown fallen from his head, his kingdom forgotten in his fractured mind. They could choose to fight him, to put him out of his misery, claiming his soul, or they could leave him to his eternal wandering, respecting the former king enough to let him persist in whatever half-life he had chosen. Either way, Vendrick's story was over. The great king who had built Drangleic had become just another hollow, no different from the mindless creatures that infested his kingdom's ruins. The bearer of the curse eventually confronted Nashandra at the Throne of Want, the seat of power in Drangleic where the flame could be linked or claimed or refused. The Child of Dark revealed her true nature, her fragmented soul trying to claim the power of the throne for herself, to feed the endless hunger that drove her. But she had underestimated the bearer of the curse, who defeated her and claimed the throne. And then came the choice, though it was different this time, more nuanced than the simple binary of link or don't link. The bearer of the curse could take the throne, could continue the cycle in some fashion, could perpetuate the Age of Fire for another span of time, or they could walk away, refusing the throne, letting events unfold without their intervention, neither linking nor preventing the linking. But there was a third path, revealed if the bearer of the curse had completed the DLC content and gathered the crowns of fallen kings from ages past. Vendrick, in a moment of clarity accessed through his memories preserved in items he had left behind, could bless these crowns with a special power, the ability to resist hollowing. With this blessing, the bearer of the curse could retain their identity even with the dark sign, could resist the curse's erosion of their mind, could remain themselves even as the world fell apart around them. It was not a cure, not truly. The curse would still be there, the cycle would still continue, but it was a way to endure, to persist, to maintain identity in the face of the curse's inevitability. The bearer of the curse could remain who they were, could continue existing without losing themselves to the hollowing, could persist through whatever came next without becoming just another mindless hollow. Dark Souls 2's message was bleaker than its predecessor. It was a story about cycles that could not be broken, about kingdoms that rose and fell and were forgotten so completely that even their names were lost. Everything in Drangleic was built on the ruins of something else. Every kingdom replaced another kingdom that had been forgotten. Every king followed the same path to the same tragic end, making the same mistakes, falling to the same temptations, ending as just another hollow or another pile of ash. The cycle continued, and there seemed to be no way to escape it. The best anyone could hope for was to endure, to resist hollowing, to maintain their sense of self even as everything else crumbled. Not hope exactly, more like grim determination, the refusal to give in even when giving in seemed inevitable. While Vendrick was building his kingdom and being manipulated by Nashandra, his brother Aldia was pursuing his own obsessive quest in the shadows of Drangleic. Aldia was a scholar unlike any other, someone who looked at the endless cycle of fire and dark and demanded to understand not just how it worked, but why it had to be this way at all. He was not content with accepting the world as it was. He wanted to understand the fundamental forces that shaped existence, and more than that, he wanted to find a way to transcend them. Aldia founded a manor, the Keep of Aldia, a sprawling estate filled with laboratories and libraries and research chambers where he conducted experiments that pushed far beyond the boundaries of what was ethical or safe. His quest for knowledge was absolute, consuming him completely, driving him to attempt things that no one else would dare. He believed that through understanding, through pushing the limits of what was possible, he might find a way to break the cycle, to free humanity from the curse, to escape the trap that Gwyn had created. His experiments were brutal and terrible. He tried to recreate the everlasting dragons, those eternal beings from the Age of Ancients, seeking to understand the source of their immortality. His laboratories were filled with failed attempts, chimeric creatures that were neither dragon nor anything else, abominations that suffered and died in service to his research. He experimented on the giants that Vendrick had brought back from the war, trying to unlock the secrets of their power, their resistance to certain magics, their unique nature. He delved into the nature of souls themselves, conducting experiments that would have horrified even the mad sorcerers of Oolacile. He sought to understand what made someone human, what the dark soul truly was, how the curse worked, and whether it could be undone. His quest for knowledge left a trail of suffering in its wake. Bodies and broken minds and creatures that existed in states of perpetual agony, all of it justified in his mind by the importance of what he was trying to achieve. And eventually Aldia discovered something crucial, a truth that changed how he understood everything. He learned that Gwyn's linking of the fire had been the first sin, the original mistake that had condemned humanity to an eternal cycle of sacrifice. The Age of Dark was meant to come naturally, was part of the intended progression from light to darkness and back again. But Gwyn had feared it so much that he had warped the natural order, creating the Undead curse as a side effect of his attempt to extend the Age of Fire indefinitely. Humanity was trapped in a cycle that Gwyn had created, forced to serve as fuel for a flame that should have been allowed to die long ago. The curse, the hollowing, all the suffering that had plagued humanity for ages beyond counting, all of it stemmed from one god's fear of the dark, one decision to defy the natural order and keep the light burning no matter the cost. This understanding drove Aldia to desperate measures. If the problem was the cycle itself, if both the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark were just different forms of bondage, then the solution was to escape the cycle entirely. He experimented on himself, transforming his body in an attempt to transcend the curse, to exist outside the normal bounds of life and death and undeath. He would become something new, something that had never existed before, something that could persist through the cycle without being bound by it. The transformation was horrific. Aldia became a mass of roots and flame, his human form completely destroyed, replaced by something that barely resembled a living being. He was barely recognizable as anything that had once been human. His body twisted and changed beyond recognition. Tentacles of burning wood writhed where his limbs had been. Flames flickered in empty spaces where his face should have been. He had become a thing of nightmare, something that should not exist. But he had achieved something remarkable. He had escaped hollowing, existed outside the normal bounds of the curse, could persist even as the cycle continued around him. He was no longer human, but he was also no longer subject to the forces that had bound humanity since Gwyn's sacrifice. He could watch the ages turn without being consumed by them, could observe the cycle without being trapped within it. Yet his escape brought him no joy, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. He had transcended the curse, but he could not share that transcendence with others. He had found a way out for himself, but he could not show anyone else the path. And so he became a witness to the cycle, appearing to those who sought understanding, explaining what he had learned, but unable to offer any real solution, any genuine hope. Nashandra was not the only child of Dark in Drangleic. Manus's shattered soul had created multiple fragments when it was destroyed, each one eventually gaining sentience and form. In Dark Souls 2's DLC areas, the bearer of the curse would encounter 3 more, each one unique, each one terrifying in their own way. Elena, the squalid queen, ruled over the sunken city of Shulva, a once great kingdom that had fallen beneath the earth. She was drawn to Sin, a great dragon whose poison had corrupted the entire region, and she sought to use his power for purposes that were never entirely clear. Whether she wanted to rule, or simply to exist, whether she was seeking fulfillment or merely following instincts she did not understand, Elena represented the Child of Dark as corrupting force, bringing ruin wherever she went. Nadalia, the Bride of Ash, had come to the old Iron King's fortress seeking something, perhaps love or purpose or simply a place to belong. But she found only his corpse, the king already dead and transformed into a demon by the time she arrived. She fragmented herself, scattering pieces of her being throughout the Iron Keep, haunting it like a ghost, bride to a corpse, forever denied whatever it was she had been seeking. Hers was a tragedy of timing, of arriving too late, of seeking connection with something already gone. Alsana, the Silent Oracle, dwelt in the frozen city of Eleam Lois, and unlike her sisters, she seemed to have found something approaching purpose or peace. She had come to the Ivory King, and he had shown her genuine kindness, had treated her with respect despite knowing what she was. When the old chaos erupted beneath his kingdom, threatening to consume everything, Alsana worked to contain it, to hold back the flames, to preserve what the Ivory King had built even after he had sacrificed himself to fight the chaos directly. Each of the Children of Dark was drawn to powerful souls, seeking to claim them, to fill the void within themselves that had been there since their creation. They were fragments trying to become whole, pieces of Manus still carrying his longing for what he had lost, his rage at what had been done to him, his nature as a being of the abyss. They brought ruin wherever they went, not always out of malice, but because their very nature was destructive, because they were fundamentally parts of the Father of the Abyss and could not escape what they were. The Crown DLCs revealed crucial information about the nature of the curse and potential ways to resist it. The bearer of the curse collected 3 crowns from 3 fallen kingdoms that had risen and fallen long before Drangleic. The crown of the sunken king from Shulva, the crown of the old Iron King from the kingdom that had sunk into lava, and the crown of the Ivory King from Eleam Lois. Each crown had belonged to a king who had sought to extend their reign, who had pursued power or immortality or understanding, who had ultimately failed and fallen like all the others. When Vendrick blessed these crowns in the memory of him before he had hollowed completely, He imbued them with a specific power, the ability to resist hollowing. It was not a cure for the curse itself. The dark sign would still be there. Death would still cause souls to drain away. But with a blessed crown, the bearer of the curse could maintain their identity indefinitely, could resist the curse's erosion of the mind, could persist as themselves no matter what came next. Aldia, if encountered by the bearer of the curse after they had proven themselves worthy of his attention, would explain his philosophy in words that cut to the heart of Dark Souls 2's themes. He told them that both light and dark were prisons, that both the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark were just different forms of bondage. Linking the fire or letting it die, both were just perpetuating the cycle in different ways, neither truly breaking free of the trap that Gwyn had created. True freedom, Aldia believed, would require transcending both light and dark, finding a way to exist outside the binary that had defined existence since the first flame had brought disparity into the world. But he offered no solution, only understanding. He had escaped the curse personally through his horrific transformation, but that was not a path he could recommend to others, not something that could save humanity as a whole. He could only bear witness to the cycle, could only watch as kingdoms rose and fell, as heroes linked fires and flames died, and everything repeated in an endless pattern. Dark Souls 2's message, especially with the DLC content, was about seeking understanding in the face of futility. The cycle could not be broken, not truly. Every attempt to break it had failed. Every kingdom that tried to endure had eventually fallen. Every king who sought to escape the curse had ended as a hollow or worse. But one could still seek knowledge, could still try to understand, could still resist hollowing even if the curse could not be cured. It was not hope exactly, more like grim determination, the refusal to give in even when the situation seemed hopeless. And through it all, the first flame continued to fade. The Age of Fire limped along, sustained by sacrifice after sacrifice, kingdom after kingdom, hero after hero burning themselves to buy just a little more time. But each cycle was shorter than the last. Each relinking bought less time. The flame was dying, slowly but inexorably, and even the sacrifices were no longer enough to hide that truth. Somewhere, in lands far to the north, where the cycle had turned more times than anyone could count, the final chapter of this story was approaching. The flame would fade one more time, the Lords of Cinder would be called upon one more time, and this time, something would be different. This time, the cycle itself would begin to break down in ways that even Aldia had not foreseen. The world would start to collapse, not just politically or socially, but physically, with time and space becoming fluid, lands from different ages converging. The Age of Fire had nearly reached its end, and when it finally died, what would be left? By the time of Dark Souls 3, the world was dying. Not metaphorically, not gradually, but actually dying in ways that could not be ignored. The Age of Fire had been extended so many times, sustained by so many sacrifices, that the fundamental fabric of reality had begun to break down. Time was becoming fluid, space was becoming unstable, kingdoms from different ages were converging, overlapping, existing in the same physical location despite being separated by centuries. This was the land of Lothric, though Lothric was not really a single land anymore. It was a convergence point, a place where the dying world was collapsing in on itself. Here, The ruins of Anor Londo sat atop the castle of Lothric, separated by impossible architecture. Here, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley existed in a state of perpetual twilight, frozen in time. Here, the kingdoms of ages past merged with the present, all of them drawn together as the world itself began to die. The first flame had been linked countless times. Lords of Cinder had sacrificed themselves over and over throughout the ages, but by this point even that was not enough. The flame was so weak that it required something unprecedented. Previous Lords of Cinder would have to be resurrected and made to link the fire again, their already burned souls serving as fuel one more time to buy just a little longer. 5 Lords of Cinder were identified, 5 beings who had linked the flame in ages past, and whose power might be enough to rekindle it one final time. There was Ludleth the Exiled, a small lord who willingly offered himself, despite the pain and fear that linking the fire would bring. There was Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, who had been forced to link the fire not out of nobility, but because his power was too great to waste. There was the Abyss Watchers, an entire legion of warriors who had fought the Abyss, bound together by the wolf blood of Artorias, who linked the fire as one. There was Yorm the Giant, who had linked the fire as part of a promise to his people, a promise that ultimately meant nothing when his capital burned. And there was Prince Lothric, who had been raised from birth for the sole purpose of linking the fire, prepared and groomed and trained his entire life to become a Lord of Cinder. But when the bells rang, when the call went out for the lords to return to their thrones and link the fire once more, they refused. All of them except Ludleth abandoned their duty, fled their thrones, chose not to burn again. The Abyss Watchers fell into civil war, the corruption they had fought for so long finally consuming them from within. Aldrich had seen visions of a coming age of the deep, and sought to devour gods to bring it about. Yorm had returned to his ruined capital and refused to leave, and Lothric, who had never wanted to be a Lord of Cinder, simply refused, staying in his chamber with his brother Lorien, declaring that the fire should be allowed to die. This created a crisis, unprecedented in all the ages. The fire was dying and the Lords of Cinder would not fulfill their duty. Something drastic was needed, and so the bells tolled again, and this time they called not to lords, but to those who had tried to link the fire and failed. The unkindled rose from their graves in the cemetery of ash. These were beings who had attempted to link the fire in the past, but had lacked the strength to do so. Instead of becoming Lords of Cinder, they had simply burned to ash, their bodies reduced to nothing, their souls too weak to fuel the flame. They had failed and been buried and forgotten. But now they were resurrected, given one more chance. The unkindled would hunt down the Lords of Cinder, would force them back to their thrones or claim their power, would gather the strength needed to link the fire when the lords themselves refused. It was a desperate measure, a last attempt to sustain the Age of Fire when even the proper lords would not. You play as one such, unkindled, called the Ashen One. You wake in the cemetery of ash, rise from your grave and begin the hunt. Your mission is clear. Find the Lords of Cinder, return them to their thrones at Firelink Shrine, and when you have gathered enough power, go to the kiln of the first flame and link the fire yourself, becoming the next Lord of Cinder even though you were never meant to bear that title. But from the very beginning, something is different about this journey. You are aided by a firekeeper, a blind woman who tends the bonfire at Firelink Shrine and helps you grow stronger. But this firekeeper is different from others. She can see something, can sense something in the darkness, something beyond the simple binary of linking or not linking the fire. She whispers of another possibility, though she does not yet understand what it means. Your journey takes you first to the Undead settlement, and then to the Road of Sacrifices, following the path of Aldrich, who fled his duty and returned to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. But before you can reach Aldrich, you must face the Abyss Watchers in Farron Keep. The Abyss Watchers were once a legion of knights who dedicated themselves to fighting the Abyss wherever it appeared. They drank the blood of the wolf, binding their souls together in the pattern of Artorias' companion Sif, becoming a single entity made of many bodies. When the Abyss threatened, they rose up as one. When they linked the fire, they burned as one. They were heroes in their time, protectors against the spreading darkness. But by the time you find them, they have fallen into madness. The blood of the wolf that bound them together has become corrupted. The abyss they fought for so long has finally tainted them from within. They do not recognize friend from foe anymore. The Abyss Watchers are fighting each other, locked in an eternal civil war, some corrupted by the abyss, others trying to destroy the corrupted, all of them trapped in a cycle of violence that has no end. You enter their fortress, the Keep of Farron, and fight your way through it, and at the heart, in their throne room, you find them still fighting. Abyss Watcher against Abyss Watcher, locked in combat, dying and rising and dying again in an endless loop. When you arrive, you become just another target, another thing to be destroyed. You fight the Watchers and they fight each other, and eventually you claim their souls, their cinders, the power of this lord who was never truly one person, but a legion acting as one. From Farron, you travel to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, a city of frozen beauty where time seems to have stopped. It is perpetual twilight here, the light never changing, the moon hanging forever in the sky. This is the city where the old gods once dwelt after abandoning Anor Londo, where Gwyndolin maintained his illusions, where the worship of the moon replaced the worship of the sun. And in the cathedral at the heart of Irithyll you find Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, devouring the gods. Aldrich was once a cleric, a holy man who developed a taste for human flesh. He ate and ate until his body liquefied, until he became a horrible sludge that could absorb anything it touched. He was so powerful that he was forced to link the fire despite his own desires. And when he was resurrected, he did not return to his throne. Instead, he came here, to the old cathedral, and began to devour the gods themselves. When you face Aldrich, you find him in the process of consuming Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun, the last god who remained in Anor Londo. Gwyndolin's body is still alive, still struggling, even as Aldrich's sludge wraps around it, absorbs it, digests it. The battle is horrifying and tragic. You fight not just Aldrich, but the corrupted form of Gwyndolin being puppeted by the Devourer, and when you win. When you claim Aldrich's soul, Gwyndolin is finally freed from the consumption that has been slowly killing him for who knows how long. With 2 lords claimed, you travel to the profaned capital, a ruined city deep beneath the surface. Here you find Yorm the Giant, a massive being who once ruled this place. Yorm had made a promise to his people. If the profaned flame ever threatened them, if disaster came, he would be there to protect them. And to fulfill this promise, he agreed to link the first flame, to become a Lord of Cinder so he would have the power to defend his capital. But when he returned from linking the fire, he found his capital in ruins. The profaned flame, a cursed fire that can never be extinguished, had consumed everything. His people were dead or transformed into horrible creatures. His promise had meant nothing. He had sacrificed himself for them, and they had died anyway. Yorm returned to the throne room of his ruined capital and sat there, surrounded by the ashes of everything he had failed to protect, refusing to leave, refusing to move, waiting for an end that would not come. When you face Yorm, you realize that normal weapons barely scratch him. He is too large, too powerful. But there is a weapon, the Storm Ruler, a massive blade designed specifically to slay giants that lies waiting in his throne room. You take up the blade and face the giant king in his moment of defeat. And perhaps the saddest part is that Yorm does not truly fight back. He goes through the motions, swings his massive cleaver, but there is no heart in it. He is waiting to die. He wants to die. And when you strike him down with the Storm Ruler, when you claim his soul, you are granting him the mercy he has been seeking. The fourth lord is Prince Lothric, and reaching him requires climbing through Lothric Castle, the seat of power in this dying world. The castle is beautiful and terrible, filled with knights who still defend it and dragons who nest in its towers, and at the very top, in the highest chamber, you find the prince. Lothric is frail, sickly, barely able to stand. He has been this way his entire life, raised from birth for one purpose, to link the fire. His bloodline was manipulated for generations to produce a perfect Lord of Cinder. He was tutored by the greatest scholars, trained by the mightiest warriors, prepared in every way for his destiny, and then, when the time came, he refused. Lothric sees no point in the cycle. He has watched lord after lord burn themselves to sustain the fire, and he has seen that it accomplishes nothing. The flame still fades, the curse still spreads, the world still dies. So he chose to sit in his chamber and watch, to let the fire fade from a distance, to refuse the sacrifice that everyone expected of him. His brother Lorien, once a mighty knight, stays with him. Lorien cannot walk, his legs cursed and broken, but he carries Lothric on his back, protects him, fights for him. The two princes are inseparable, their fates bound together. When you fight them, you fight both at once, Lorien wielding his flaming sword while Lothric casts magic from his brother's back. And when you defeat them, when you claim Lothric's soul, when you have finally gathered all the Lords of Cinder, you can return to Firelink Shrine and place their souls on their thrones. This opens the path to the kiln of the first flame, to the place where this has all been leading. You can finally attempt to link the fire yourself, to become a Lord of Cinder, to continue the cycle one more time. But there is one more thing you must face first. The first flame is not undefended. It has a guardian, a final test for any who would seek to link it or claim it for other purposes. This guardian is the Soul of Cinder, and it is not a person but a concept, a manifestation, an amalgamation of every single being who has ever linked the fire throughout all the ages. You descend through the kiln, through tunnels of ashen monuments to dead kingdoms, past the remnants of everything that has burned to fuel the flame, and at the centre, at the heart of the dying first flame, the Soul of Cinder rises to face you. It has no single form. It shifts and changes, wielding different weapons, using different styles, representing all the different lords who have fed the flame. It uses sorcery like the ancient mages. It wields great swords like the mighty warriors. It uses pyromancy like the witch's disciples. It fights with a curved sword and quick strikes. And in its second phase, when it has been pushed to its limit, it takes the form of Lord Gwyn himself, wielding the fighting style of the first Lord of Cinder, the one who started this entire cycle. The Soul of Cinder is not malicious. It is not evil. It is simply doing its duty, testing you, ensuring that you are worthy. If you are strong enough to defeat it, then you are strong enough to link the flame. If you fail, then you were never meant to bear that burden. It is the world's final defense against those who would seek to control or destroy the first flame, and it embodies the sacrifice of every hero who has ever given themselves to the fire. The battle is everything Dark Souls combat has built toward. All your skill, all your learning, all your persistence is tested here. And when you finally strike down the Soul of Cinder, when it falls to its knees and dissolves into ash, you stand alone before the first flame. And now you must choose. But unlike in previous Dark Souls games, there are more than two options here. The Age of Fire has lasted so long, has been sustained through so many sacrifices, that new paths have opened up, new possibilities that previous heroes never had. The first option is to link the fire, just as intended. You can step into the flame, can sacrifice yourself just as Gwyn did, just as all the Lords of Cinder did. You will burn, your body consumed, your soul becoming fuel. You will become a Lord of Cinder yourself, extending the Age of Fire a little longer. The cycle continues. Another kingdom will rise, another will fall, and eventually another unkindled will wake to do what you have done. It solves nothing, but it buys time, and perhaps that is enough. The second option is to summon your Firekeeper. If you have given her the eyes of a Firekeeper, eyes that let her see beyond the surface of things, she has discovered something. She can touch the flame without burning. She can take it in her hands and let it fade gently, ushering in an age of dark that is not violent but peaceful. The fire dies, the darkness comes, but it is not the horror that Gwyn feared. It is simply change, transformation, a new age beginning as the old age ends. But there is a third option, darker and more complex. If you have followed the questline of Uria of Londor, if you have embraced the dark sigils and allowed yourself to become something more than just unkindled, you can usurp the flame. Instead of linking it or letting it die, you can claim it for yourself, can take the power of the first flame and make it your own. You become the Lord of Hollows, a being beyond both light and dark, and you can use the flame as you see fit. It is not the Age of Fire and not the Age of Dark, but something new, something unprecedented, something that might break the cycle, or might simply create a new cycle of your own. And there is a fourth option, revealed in the DLC. You can simply walk away. You can refuse all of it, can decline to make any choice, can leave the flame to its fate without your intervention. Perhaps someone else will come. Perhaps the flame will die on its own. Perhaps the cycle will finally end, not through grand gestures, but through simple exhaustion, through everyone finally deciding that this burden is not worth bearing anymore. Dark Souls 3's endings reflect different philosophies about the cycle and what should be done with it. Link the fire and you believe that preserving what exists, even if it is flawed, is better than the uncertainty of change. Let it die and you believe that natural order should be allowed to resume. that ages should end and new ages should begin. Usurp it, and you believe that the cycle itself is the problem, that someone needs to take control and reshape things fundamentally. Walk away, and you believe that your choice does not matter, that the world will continue or end regardless of what you do. But there is one more revelation in the DLC, one more piece of the story. In the Ringed City, the final DLC for Dark Souls 3, you travel to the end of the world, to a place where time has collapsed completely, where every age exists simultaneously, and there, at the very end, you find the Dark Soul itself, the original Dark Soul that the furtive pygmy discovered, split and scattered and reformed over countless ages. A being called the Slave Knight Gale has been collecting the fragments, devouring them, trying to reunite the Dark Soul into a single whole, and in doing so he has become a monster, driven mad by the power he has consumed, transformed into something that might be humanity's ultimate expression or its ultimate corruption. You fight him in the ashen wasteland, at the end of everything, surrounded by the ruins of all the ages, and when you defeat him, you claim the Dark Soul for yourself. What does this mean? The game never says explicitly, but it suggests that the story is not really about fire and dark, not about gods and humans, not about linking or not linking the flame. The story is about what you choose to do with the power you inherit, about whether you use it to continue old cycles or create new possibilities. And perhaps most poignantly, the Ringed City also shows you a painter, a young girl who is creating a new painted world. The painted worlds exist outside the normal cycle, pocket dimensions where people can live and die without feeding the flame. The painter tells you that she will paint a new world, a cold, dark, gentle place, using the Dark Soul as pigment. She will create something new from the ashes of everything that has burned. Maybe that is the answer. Maybe the way to end the cycle is not to fight it or feed it, but to step outside it entirely, to create something new in a space where the old rules do not apply. Maybe the painted world, that cold, dark, gentle place, is what has always been needed. A home for the souls who are tired of burning. And so we reach the end of this journey, though ending is perhaps the wrong word. The Dark Souls trilogy is about cycles, about how things repeat, about how the same questions keep being asked even when the answers never satisfy. Thousands of years passed between the first game and the last. Kingdoms rose and fell, heroes linked fires and flames died, and through it all the fundamental question remained: should you sacrifice yourself to preserve what is, or should you let things end and hope that what comes next will be better? The trilogy never gives you a definitive answer. It presents the choice and lets you decide. Link the fire, let it die, usurp it, walk away, find a new world entirely. Each option has merit, each option has consequences, and none of them feel entirely like a victory because the world is too worn, too tired, too hollowed out by ages of sacrifice for any single action to fix everything. What makes Dark Souls so compelling is how it uses this cycle to explore ideas about duty and choice, about what we owe to the past and what we owe to the future, about whether noble sacrifices are really noble if they only delay the inevitable. Gwyn sacrificed himself to preserve his Age of Fire, but that sacrifice created the Undead curse, condemned humanity to endless suffering, and ultimately only bought time before the same crisis arose again. Was his sacrifice heroic or selfish? Did he save the world, or damn it, the chosen undead, the bearer of the curse, the Ashen One. Each of these heroes faces the same impossible choice, and the game respects you enough not to tell you what the right answer is. It presents the information, shows you the consequences of past choices, and then steps back and lets you decide for yourself. Throughout this entire journey, we have seen incredible things. We have seen gods who feared the dark enough to warp reality itself. We have seen heroes who sacrificed everything only to be forgotten or misremembered. We have seen kingdoms that shone like stars and then crumbled into ash. We have seen the abyss spreading and the flame dying and the world slowly succumbing to entropy. And through it all, there have been individuals making choices. Gwyn chose to link the fire. Artorias chose to fight the abyss. Vendrick chose to walk away from his throne. Lothric chose to refuse his destiny. Every character in these games is making a choice about what they believe matters, about what is worth fighting for, about whether the old ways should be preserved or new paths should be forged. The Dark Souls trilogy is not a happy story. There is no triumphant ending where everything is fixed and everyone is saved. But it is a powerful story, one that respects its players' intelligence, one that trusts you to grapple with complex questions about duty and destiny and choice. It is about maintaining your identity in a world that wants to strip it away, about finding meaning in a universe that seems fundamentally meaningless, about continuing to fight even when every fight feels futile. And maybe that is the ultimate message. Not that you can break the cycle, not that you can fix everything, not that your choices will solve all problems, but that you can persist. You can maintain who you are. You can make choices that reflect your values even in a dying world. You can refuse to give in to despair even when despair seems like the only reasonable response. The Dark Souls trilogy is a testament to persistence, to continuing to play even when you have died 1,000 times, to continuing to hope even when hope seems foolish. It is about finding beauty in ruins, meaning in ashes, light in darkness. Not because the world is fair or kind or just, but because you choose to see those things, choose to create them, choose to be the one who persists when everything else has given up. So rest well tonight. Let this tale of dying flames and eternal cycles carry you into sleep. Tomorrow you can wake and face your own world, your own choices, your own version of whether to keep old fires burning or to let them die and see what comes next. And whatever you choose, remember that the choice is yours. The cycle may be eternal, but your response to it, your decision about what matters, that is always your own. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Dark Souls trilogy. If you enjoyed this dive into one of gaming's darkest and most thoughtful narratives, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more lore videos to explore together, so many more worlds to delve into. Until next time, may the flames guide thee.